I'm so sorry. And so we'll be hearing from them here in just a couple of minutes. By way of introduction to this issue, this is coming back before the Commission. At the last meeting that we were at in mid-December, the Commission gave us permission to proceed with an update of the ALP, which is an acronym for Airport Layout Plan, and to take that on to the Federal Aviation Administration in terms of updating it. But before we do that, we're going to bring it back to you at the end of March, which is the committed timeline that we discussed. We're on track for that. And this is the master, if you will, development conceptual design map. It's not binding. It's not the green light to proceed with any developments. It's simply a master planning tool that the FAA uses to ascertain what is the demand of each airport if they were to be optimally built out, compatible with the community and the size airport that they are. So that's on track. But the second part that we're going to bring back to you is the presentation today, and that is basically the kickoff of the environmental assessment associated with those improvements that will be shown on the ALP that are specific to the east side of the airport, the terminal side of the airport. So today the objectives of our presentation, which will be about 15 minutes, and then we want to open it up to questions to answer your specific questions most importantly. But we're going to show you the environmental assessment in terms of the scope. Then we'll talk about the schedule, the milestones, and how the process works. And then most importantly for your direction to us as well as the community, outline the proposed community involvement, which is going to be very, very robust and numerous opportunities, as well as the formation of a community input committee. So having said that, I will turn it over to Rick, who will go through the next portions of the slide.
Thank you.
Let me ask a question.
Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, because when we approved the airport layout plan a few months ago, that set the stage to, if approved by the FAA, to develop the start an EA process. And that EA process was going to include also the west side development. So today we're looking at part of that EA plan, but just on the east side?
So, George, there's two separate environmental assessments that are contemplated. One is on the east side, and that's the terminal area and the east side improvements. Those are the portions of the original airport layout plan that we submitted, the master plan, that were approved. And those are deemed as having a separate need and purpose, which Rick will be able to describe in a little bit more detail. And so we're moving ahead right now with the environmental assessment on the terminal side and east side. In the meantime, we're submitting a new airport layout plan for the airfield and west side. When that is approved, we will also be looking at an environmental assessment process there, and those environmental assessments will run somewhat parallel to each other, but they're separate needs.
Okay, because I thought that when we talked about the dates, that we would be looking at the EA for the west side starting sometime this summer?
In June.
In June,
July.
and so this one will sort of coincide with it?
Correct.
Okay. It's a little confusing.
That was a good
It's going to get more confusing. Just wait till I say something.
Yeah, and so, George, really there's separate purpose and needs associated with what's happening on the airfield with looking at the separations and what's happening with the need for a terminal and such, which exists regardless what happens with changing aircraft technologies.
And that came about because we approved a year ago, or 2 years ago, we approved the master plan, which then went to the FAA, and they approved it, which set the stage to do the EA for the east side.
Correct. They approved everything really except the separation on the west side between the runway and the taxiway. And about that same time, it was becoming clear what that next generation of aircraft technology is going to be doing with wingspans. And we decided to stop and really examine through the air services study what changes we may need to make to that airfield layout, which affects all the west side really, primarily. And that's the direction that the board gave us at our last meeting, which was to look at resubmitting an airport layout plan with 400-foot separations from the east side taxiway to the center line of the runway and the west side taxiway, as well as a 150-foot wide runway.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm Rick Dunkelberg with Mead and Hunt. And George, your question segued very greatly into what you're going to start off with. And for Patty's edification and enjoyment, since she didn't go all the way through the master plan with us, you're absolutely right. When this board approved the master plan for the airport a couple of years ago, sent it to the FAA. The FAA conditionally approved that airport layout plan subsequent to additional environmental work except for the west side. And so what that meant was that in the eyes of the FAA, any development on the east side was eligible for environmental considerations and environmental development. They approved that development. So we've now initiated that process. And it's important to keep the two EAs separate because they have, and this is a term of art, different purposes and needs that need to be addressed. The east side with the terminal building needs to be reconfigured, redesigned, reconstructed because there's a lot of existing deficiencies with that. And so that's what we're addressing today. So the east side EA will address obviously the terminal and terminal building, adjacent ancillary buildings, apron issues. Remember, the apron drains into the terminal building. Any operational issues from congestion on the east side with the way aircraft park, and then some roadway connectivity issues. So this is all on the east side. This was described in the master plan, and we're using the approved development plan, which you all approved in the master plan, as the guide for that environmental document. And this is an environmental document per federal regulations. It's a FAA and National Environmental Policy Act driven environmental assessment, which is different than a local requirement. So we're blending in some local requirements into this document. We are also going to prepare this EA and the subsequent EA to a higher standard of development and community involvement than is normally done in an EA. We're going to develop it to what we call EIS standards. So we're going beyond and above what is normally done. Okay, so basically in a nutshell, we will look at terminal area redevelopment, including the new terminal building, the transit center, ancillary auto parking, roadway improvements, apron improvements, FBO relocation, the noise wall, which we've talked about for a number of years now that we've got to the point where we can really design that, and then other ancillary projects. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, and the noise wall is related to the North 40 residents?
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Not the Buttermilk side?
No, it's just on the east. That's correct.
Okay.
And in addition to helping us reduce noise effects, we're also using that as a emissions barrier to keep some of those emissions on the airport.
Okay.
It's important to note that it will not change the classification of the airport. The airport will stay exactly as it is. It will not change the type of aircraft operating at the airport because this project has what we call independent utility. The terminal building is in such need for redo that it would have to be done regardless of what happened to the west side. So this is a standalone project. The forecast of aircraft operations will be the same with or without the project. From an environmental standpoint, that's very important because we're not inducing growth, it's not a capacity project, we're not increasing the ability of the airfield or the airport to accommodate different numbers of aircraft with the passengers, with the terminal. Yes, ma'am.
Well, Steve, I have to wait for him to
I'm
call
sorry.
me. Thank you, that's good. Appreciate that. Keep us moving. I want you to explain a little bit about the relationship on that statement because what our forecast of aircraft type tells us that without the realignment of the runways and the appropriate separations for safety, that we will have a reducing number of flights that are actually able to use our airport.
Correct.
And so, you know, again, if we were to do nothing, we could eventually see commercial flights steadily phased out of the airport,
Yes.
and then the demand wouldn't necessarily be there for quite the same terminal.
Yes, the way that you evaluate impacts in an environmental document is, will the proposed project, and the proposed project here in a nutshell is the terminal building. If we redo the terminal building, will it cause new or different types of aircraft to operate at the airport?
Okay,
And it will not.
okay, so that's
That's correct. Now,
timeline.
to carry that one step further, though, prudent planning says that we know that in the future things may change. So we want to do our planning for the terminal building in the immediate terminal area to the extent that in the future we're not hemmed in and we've got room to change if we need to add additional gates or additional whatever it is when and if aircraft change in the future.
I mean, I think it's a fair statement to make that the board is anticipating making the changes necessary to maintain at least the air
Exactly.
service commercial that we have today. But I just was wondering about how it is not related, which you've
Right.
just explained, to
And
whether or
we'll-
not the other changes, because West Side EIS is a separate document, but it talks both about second FBO as well as realignment, and those are different components
That's
of that
correct.
same EIS.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, this is just a blow-up of the page from the master plan, which shows the east side development concept for long-term airport development, which was approved in the master plan. And that whole concept, we will be evaluating the environmental consequences of if that is developed in the manner shown. And it's long-term, and it's not to say that it will be developed in that. It's not committing this body to anything other than evaluating the effects, both positive and negative, of what would occur if that plan were implemented.
This is something that I should be aware of since I've tried to follow this issue over the years. But the future intersection, moving that to the Up Valley end of the airport, was that a lengthy discussion with the board?
Yes. It was a separate discussion that had to do with the highway access improvement plan.
With
Yeah.
all the CDOT?
Right, so we have a access plan that's
Right,
approved
right.
by the board and with CDOT. And that was, as I recall, that was in process before I even got here, and I think was approved a couple
Well,
of years after I got here.
yeah,
But so that, the alignment, we worked closely with Public Works and CDOT to ensure that it matched up to that.
And the city of Aspen and all the residents.
Right, because
of-
I was part of that before I left office, and
Mm-hmm.
then while I was out of office, I worked at a business that was right there, so I got back involved in it. And just so the board knows, I'm not sure I would agree with moving the location, but we're moving forward, so, but I just needed to get that opinion out there. I just think the issues with the signalization and that stretch are going to be very difficult
Right.
in the long run. Okay, thanks, I just want to make sure that,
And the other thing that, as we prepare the environmental document and we show locations of facilities, those locations are not set in stone. They are, it's understood from all the agencies that we deal with, especially the FAA, that as you get down to final design and construction drawings, things are going to change. So there's always going to be flexibility there. And the other thing is that as we move through the preparation of this document and the following documents, there will be several steps along the way, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit, where this board will have the ability to comment, make decisions, give us direction as we carry through. So there's an awful lot of points in here that you all will have a lot of involvement in and give us direction on how to move forward with the process. Yes, sir.
So Rick, could the EA actually show that intersection shown on the master plan is not the best location for that, and that would be a flexible thing to shift that one way or
The
the
answer to
other?
that is probably no. And the reason is because when you are preparing environmental documents, there are certain things which we have to consider as a given condition. And since that has been through a approved planning process and a decision made in the public arena, then that is basically a given condition that we deal
okay.
with. Correct.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Okay, remember, this is a federally defined process and program which we are going through. The National Environmental Policy Act, or we refer to that as NEPA, requires consideration of environmental consequences of any federal action before that action is taken. So if there's a major federal action that can have a significant effect on the environment, we have to go through an environmental process. And it's prepared to determine if environmental impact may occur in any of the NEPA-defined categories that exceed a threshold of significance. And I'll go through what those are and what it means. We do an in-depth review of potential environmental impacts for the proposed action and then reasonable alternatives to that proposed action. So we will go through an alternatives evaluation and look at that. And obviously it provides disclosure of all the alternatives, potential impacts, and any potential mitigation so that you all, as the decision makers, can make an informed decision as we move forward. And we'll disclose all the impacts. This is not a document which makes a decision for you. It's a document which allows you to make a decision whether you want to move forward or not. Okay? Okay, and these chapters are defined by the federal regulation. And we will go through these. As we finish each chapter, we will come back to this board, present our findings to you, present the findings that we've had from the community, and then get you all's direction and input. But the first one is the purpose and need. And that obviously is why we're doing the project and what is the project. What's the need for the project and what are we trying to do? We then look at alternatives, and that'll be including the proposed action as defined in the master plan, and then reasonable alternatives to that. The affected environment basically is what's there now, and then the consequences or the impacts to the proposed action and those reasonable alternatives. And then are there mitigation measures, which we're going to look at to mitigate any impacts? Are there certain things that we can do beyond to mitigate or minimize those impacts? Okay? Depending on how you look at it, there's between 18, 19, or 23 different categories and how you break these down. But these are all what we call resource categories that we will evaluate the impacts to for all the alternatives that we evaluate. And now obviously there's one or two that we will not. For instance, coastal zone management plans. We're landlocked, we're not going to pay any attention to coastal zone management. But almost all the others will have some effect on this document we're preparing. And one of the most significant from our local community concerns is under the visual. And because of the visual concerns of the community, the major portion of this document that we are initiating today will be the design concepts for the terminal building. In fact, our whole phase one of this document is going to consist of community outreach, community input through the design concept, whole portion of the terminal building. That's going to take up a lot of time and a lot of effort. But at the end of that process, this board will make a decision whether to move forward. And what we would carry forward in the environmental consequences section would be 2 design concepts so that we can evaluate then the impacts of those 2 concepts once this board has approved the overall generalized concepts of that terminal building. And the benchmark we're going to use to start that will be the master plan benchmark, which we've gone through a lot of effort with the community to arrive at that point. Yes, sir.
Rick, on the different categories it mentions, Department of Transportation Act, Section 4F.
Correct.
What does that refer
It's
to?
a very unique statute, and it applies only to transportation projects, which means highways, airports, railroads. funded with federal funds through the federal government. It is sometimes a separate document which evaluates impacts to recreation properties, open space properties, historic properties, that we have to evaluate all reasonable and prudent alternatives to make sure that there's not a better alternative if we're going to negatively impact that specific property. It's basically, I would look at those as recreation properties or historic properties. And that won't be a huge effort on the east side, but on the west side it will be a major effort.
Okay, thank you.
And it's very unique to the Department of Transportation. Okay, so as we go through this process, just so you all know who's responsible for the parties, John, #1 guy, Rick Dunkelberg, I'll be the project director, and Kate Andrus is the project manager. We're the faces you will see from the consulting team at all the meetings, at everything we do, and we're the overall end responsibility for the preparation of the project. Luckily, we've had the opportunity to work with you all for several years, and we think we've got a pretty good handle on what the community wants to look for in a process. This is a project schedule which shows very generally phase 1 and phase 2 of the project. We have the entire project scoped. The scope has been reviewed and approved by the FAA. We have a fee which has been approved by the FAA. But we only have phase 1 of the project actually funded and with us notice to proceed to do that. The way we have the phases broken down is that phase 1 will take us up through the design concepts of the terminal building and some ancillary buildings associated with it. At that point, obviously this body has the opportunity to say, stop, hold it, go back, we don't like what you all have come up with, give us some more direction, or whatever it is. And once we reach an approval process of at least 2 concepts, then we move into phase 2, and we look at the environmental consequences of that. So the overall project is the environmental assessment for the east side, the first phase being concentrated on the terminal building itself.
George?
So Rick, how does the funding work? And who funds it? If we're doing phases and then if we need to backtrack and spend more time, how does that work?
The funding is generally 90% FAA funding for the whole project. The local community funds 10%. There's the possibility of state matching grants for some of the local 10%. Okay, that funding is all in place, has been approved by this board. If we get a third of the way through this and find out that things are going to the extent that you all don't like it and tell us to go back and do it again, then that's our fault. And we just go back and we do it again. Hopefully, we're wise enough to make sure we don't get to that point. You know, we will meet with you all periodically and with the public, and we'll make sure that, you know, we're at least all on board from a conceptual standpoint before we go to the impact section. And remember that this is a conceptual outline, sizing, and placement of the terminal building. It's not the final design of the terminal building. That's a whole other project, which will get down and look at the size of rooms, you know, what the lampshades look like, and, you know, that kind of stuff. But we're not there yet. That's still a whole other process to go through.
Patty, and then
So
Rachel.
just the EA, just the environmental assessment process, minimum really is 2 years. I mean, if we decided we needed changes, it would extend that time frame, obviously.
Well, we are looking at a worst-case scenario.
Of the 2 year before we get FAA review and approval.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's a pretty good chance we could tighten that up some, but in our minds, we put together a schedule which includes a lot of public comment, public
Knowing our
involvement.
community, I think that was
Yes.
a wise decision.
And so, you know, we're taking that into consideration. Now, George brought up a point in the very beginning and asked the question about the West Side EA. From our overall programming schedule, that can start concurrently with this one.
Right.
Before we get to the conclusion of this. We'll be doing both of them concurrently for a little while.
So one could end before the other, so we could proceed on either side to the next phase, given where we are on either side.
It's some of the
We
options
have a
we'd
lot
like.
going on. is what
Yes,
I'm-
it's some of the options we'd like to give you all so you can you can make those decisions and do what you want as you go down the road. And you're not tied into one certain side.
Okay.
Okay, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you for the schedule. This is helpful, and these processes do take a while. But what I'm wondering is, are these kind of check back points with our board on the kind of block stair steps? So that
Yes, that's the way we have anticipated now.
okay.
Again, history tells us that there may be 2 or 3 of those in each one of those.
Sure,
You know,
sure.
as we come back, and if you want more information or more, we'll give it to you.
Okay, and then the other kind of question and perhaps suggestion, the fourth bullet is conceptual terminal design, the next one's intermediate terminal design, and then when we go into the next phase 2 of this, we get terminal and engineering design to 25%. And I don't know where would be an appropriate place to interject this, but it seems that we really have a wealth of talent in this community, in the architectural and design community, and kind of cutting edge. And it might be good if you could organize a charrette of those type of characters to add input to the terminal design.
You are segueing right into it.
How about that?
We worked on this, didn't we? One of the issues that we would like to leave today with your all's concurrence is we are suggesting putting together a community input committee to help us through this. The first phase of that community input committee meeting would be at the end of February. We have generally scheduled the first part of the visioning process. And we are asking you all for input on who to be included in that committee. And I think John's got some ideas on discussing those things with you. But we'd like to have that committee put in place, middle of February or so that we can then start our mini charrettes and things of that nature as we go through the process.
Okay.
And that's exactly what we have envisioned for doing that.
Okay, great, yeah, because I'm sure we have a lot of input from many areas,
Yes.
but in particular, I think that could be valuable for.
And one of the, I like to think long range down the road is that, as I said, the next phase on this side would be the actual design of the terminal building. And that committee would be valuable when we get down to the actual design elements.
Sure.
And to carry that committee forward.
Yeah, it's always a matter of kind of plugging people in at the
Oh,
right
yeah.
time so they feel it's valuable for their time and our project.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide. And that's what we just segued into. This is a a very unique, non-standard process we're going through. If we were doing just a normal EA under different circumstances, all of phase 1 probably would not even be in the process. So we have a lot of community outreach, community involvement. We've got planned public workshops, coffee chats, kitchen chats, small group meetings, social media outreach, all those things, a whole plethora of different outreach programs. And we'd like to come back to this body on February 24th and present in more detail. Oh,
10th. So 10th, we're going to
That's right,
talk
okay.
about the, yeah.
That's right.
And then-
I'm confused. February 10th, come back and talk about the community input committee, and then get some direction, some names, so we can get that committee going. Then on the 24th, come back to this body with a report on what we presented the day before at that committee meeting and to the public, and maybe give you a little bit more extensive community involvement outline. We've got lots of working sessions, lots of visioning, design concept. And another thing that's very unique here is we are going to the full maximum 25% allowable, fundable, preliminary engineering and architectural design for the facility, which is going to take us a lot farther down the road.
Just something, and I know that you're well aware of this, having done this before here. I just think we need to keep in mind as we create kitchen meetings and coffees and workshops, we have a great group that we've used at the airport over the years, and we need to make sure we keep them, some of those members that I know will move forward, intact, not burn them out.
Right.
I've kind of heard from people, oh God, more airport meetings, but I think those are good minds because of the history. So as best we can accommodate keeping those minds at the table, I think is important for us. And I know you know most of those faces, so.
No, I 100% agree, that's right. Okay, next one. Again, we're going to need direction from this body on who would be on our community input committee and who all those should be. We'll talk about that on the 10th, and then we have kickoff meetings and community involvement meetings scheduled for February 24th. As we start our screening process.
Yeah, and, sorry, Steve.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I jump in. To your point, in putting together this input committee, we've had good citizen engagement, I think, on a lot of levels when we did our design guidelines, as we went through the master planning process. And so we do have a group of citizens, I think, to draw on that have experience, hopefully not burnout at this point. That's going to be another question. But I think what, we would suggest is, without bringing a specific list of names to you today, obviously using the list from the design guidelines discussion as a starting point, using the list from our master plan. I forget what we called that group.
It was a community input committee.
Community
also,
input.
right.
Okay, it was also a community input committee as a place to start creating a list of folks who might be interested. Hearing from you all, who, because I'm sure since we started these discussions now 4 years ago, a lot of folks have been talking to you and giving
Was
their
it only
opinion.
4 years ago?
It was only unbelievably, it was only 4 years ago. But folks that you think you might want to see more deeply immersed in the process, we're trying to keep, while we started off with the goal of keeping it around 10 or 15, I think we upped that to 20.
Real quick.
As we were talking even this morning. But what we would like to do is get a pool of names together along those lines and maybe even hear some from you today, and we can start to contact folks, engage their interest and energy levels in terms of participating long term, and then we can come back on the 10th and talk about who's interested and who may not have time but may participate in another way.
Patty and then George.
Yeah, just real quick, John, you, I know with your little coffee things at the airport, you probably created a list of people who haven't really been involved in our already standing committees, and that would be great, fresh energy, I think, to tap into some of those names of people. I'm sure you kept great records of those coffees.
I did not,
But
but
Pat did.
somebody else did, yes.
Because I think that would be some
Yeah.
new blood that was obviously interested enough to come out to the airport and meet with John, like me.
So I know it's important to have the historic perspective, people that have been involved, but it seems like we're doing sort of a top-down versus a bottom-up. What I mean by that is, shouldn't we be doing an outreach saying, is there anybody in the community who's interested in serving on this committee? Please apply, similar to applying to a board, and then we can sort of discuss those names, so we have a more of a broader outreach versus just relying on names that we may know of, and it's not quite as inclusive.
The only caution I'd give you is that tends to take a lot of time, both for the collection and then the vetting process for the board. While we do have an interested cohort that already has a lot of background. And so, but we're also concerned about excluding folks who might have an interest. And so in the public process, we're anticipating a number of open houses and such visioning kind of sessions are going to be advertised and open to anyone, and all that input is going to come back to the board. I don't know, Rick, if you have more that you'd want to say about those, because we're trying to balance being able to structure and move the process forward and quickly as well as leaving it open.
Yeah, and one thing we have found is that, first of all, this committee and the committee meetings are open to the public, obviously. Anybody wants to show up. And what we have found in the past is that sometimes we will have one or two people that are very, very interested and come to these meetings. At that point, we just ask if they want to be a member of the committee, formal, and we just add their name to it. So sometimes just by interest, that committee grows. And so there are opportunities along the way for people to be totally involved in what they're interested in, and that's the way we like to leave it.
And we'll, just one quick follow-up, and we'll also be utilizing our Pick and Connects in terms of being able to not only get information out, but having a venue for feedback. The citizens can pose questions or make comments, and we would get that to you guys.
Yes.
Yes, and in fact, we talked about that this morning, and the discussion was how do we make that look as much like the live sessions or the face-to-face sessions that we're doing. We don't have that figured out yet, but Pick and Connect is going to be a tool definitely that we use and is available.
Okay, Rachel?
I like what you're suggesting, George, but I also can see the pitfalls. And I think there may be a little bit of a hybrid. What I had been thinking of is that I really would like to create a list of interest groups that make sure they're represented in the group. And I'm sure that's what you guys have been thinking. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's like Aspen Chamber Resort Association, City of Aspen, Stay Aspen Snowmass, Snowmass Village, Town Government, RAFTA, obviously the transportation component I think is huge. It's going to deserve some of the greatest work. Someone from the AABC Business Center interest group, and it's not that every group has to be involved, but this is starting points. If you had a Restaurant Hotel Association, you may find there's no one with the Restaurant Association who's not too busy to attend regularly, but someone with the Hotel Association might. They are very active. Someone representing general aviation, making sure their concerns are taken care of. The Young Professionals Association might be a good way to involve some of the younger generations. ASC, Buttermilk Homeowners Association, North 40. There's just a lot of groups, and it's great when you can find someone who almost fills two roles or more than two roles. But I would think a lot about trying to make sure the special interest groups are covered. You could then also obviously have, quote, at-large appointments, and perhaps we could advertise differently to say, would you like to be involved? Here's the first meeting date, and invite them as members of the public and see who trails off and who continues to stay with it, and then kind of add them as group members or something like that. I appreciate your thoughtfulness about new people and bringing it up, and also certainly involving people who've been there in the past, and but also making sure all the points of view are somehow represented.
Yeah, I talked to John about one person. I already told them about this because I thought that they would be a person who would be interested in it. And they've been following the whole airport process from a distance, but know probably as much about it as I do. And so I put it out to my friend that, he might be interested in this, and I would like a mechanism that some, new blood can become involved. But I like your approach too, Rachel. I might add some environmental group, because there are, the air emissions and the energy use and all those kind of issues. So maybe some, have an environmental community representative could be another interest group.
Yeah.
And part of our thought process of this was, if we can get the committee established now, then we can use that same committee to help us when we start the West Side development. And because there'll be a lot of similar issues there, and also we like that same input.
Do you want us to let them know that ahead of time?
No.
No comment.
That seems like that would be difficult, because, as you say, you're going to have two processes that will sort of coincide, and so the commitment on some of these people could be way above, and then you end up with a very small group, and you don't get the broad representation and interaction.
To be honest, how these things will typically work at the visioning stage, and when we're talking about vision and values and concept, there's usually a lot of energy. And then as we get into addressing more specific issues, the committee tends to self-select a little bit in terms of participation. You know, those who will have energy on conservation versus general aviation issues or such, you tend to get a little bit more self-selection throughout the process, which is part of the reason it's important for us to have a large enough committee to start with enough diversity of interests represented, you know, from the community and from airport users or stakeholders, that there's enough interested parties as we get down to the more specific issues, that there's still folks with energy to give you the input on the more discrete kind of questions. And so we were thinking along the lines of how do we identify the interests that need to be at the table. And actually I think our lists are pretty similar so far, and you know, the more input we can get along those lines, we can start to identify people from those interests who have some energy on it, maybe even have some experience with it, and bring those names back to you.
Okay.
Any other interests that you guys that we've missed? I would note the other municipality that's taken an interest is actually Basalt. They passed a resolution of interest in the airport.
Oh, great.
That may be another entity.
Great.
I think local caucus groups, particularly the Woody Creek Caucus, which has been involved
flight
because
path.
of the flight path especially, which that doesn't affect the east side, but they've
No,
been
but
interested
everything's
in it
connected.
before. So,
Everything's connected.
yeah.
Okay, next
Great.
slide.
Oh,
It's your basic thank you slide.
We like the thank you slide.
What I'd like to leave y'all with, though, is a couple points. One is that remember, throughout this process, you all will be involved, and there will be decision points all along the way that we will ask you to make decisions to give us guidance to carry on to the next phase. And that even at the end of this project, when we complete this EA and we submit it to the FAA, that still is not committed you all to spend any money or do anything beyond that. It's just an evaluation of the environmental effects and what we've agreed upon, and then we send that to the FAA. You can change your mind anytime along the way. It's just one more step in the process.
What's the time frame? How good are EAs? How long do they last?
Excellent question.
I was holding that for you.
I'd like to say 3 years. From the date we get what's called a finding of no significant impact
Right.
to when you start the project.
So it gives us some wiggle room if we
Yes.
decide to go forward on one side and slow down on the other.
That's correct. There is wiggle room. And then the other question is, what defines starting the project? You know, is it?
Right. Is it the first shovel with all of our gold-plated shovels?
It's probably.
Or is it the donuts and coffee?
It's more like the first architect that hits the key to start designing
Okay.
the structure.
We gotta move slowly.
I have to share this with you on this chart here that shows that looks like a football field, and we used to actually chart football games in a similar manner. Listening on the radio, but my dad was the one who started that.
Really?
And you have the kickoff up here, and I wrote touchdown down
There you
there.
go.
But maybe the touchdowns another chart down the road where we actually get the thing built.
that gets us to halftime.
Yeah, it only gets us to 25 yards. We still have 75 yards to go.
That's when the marching band comes out. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you. You know, and it's nice to see you again.
It's nice to see
And you
you.
know one thing you've learned? You don't come in a suit and tie anymore.
No, ma'am.
Always come in a suit and tie.
I learned my lesson a long time
You
ago.
always just say, come on, what are you doing? It's good to see you. And nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank y'all. We'll be back.
Thanks.
So I did email ComDev. We're running I thought that might be a longer discussion for us.
We could do
So,
some of the other smaller.
you want to go to, well, let's see, what can we go to? Future agendas? Prep for the city meeting? Maybe we could go to that one next.
I do have a question on that. The bears? I guess I thought, well, we're gonna have the whole bear presentation again with more information. Is that the plan, or are we just gonna ask
Well,
the city if they want the bear presentation?
That's part of what we need to talk about, because I wasn't clear on what the intent was, if the intent was for us to even have that in a joint meeting, if the intent was to encourage the city to hear the presentation from Division of Wildlife. It came up. So what Patty's asking about is when Division of Wildlife was in front of us on the bear management issues, they had not gone to the city. We had a brief discussion about, well, you know, maybe that's a good topic for the joint meeting. It wasn't totally clear to me what we were looking for
Me
either.
neither.
Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I'd love to see it as part of the agenda if the Colorado Parks and Wildlife folks are available to give the presentation at that time. And again, the city agrees to it, but I think it'd be valuable in terms of us talking to them about greater and enhanced joint efforts for next year, you know, for the coming bear season. But I also thought we'd already generated a small list of topics for that meeting, and then at a previous prep for the joint city-county meeting, and you and Steve Barwick would be working to see which of those were most germane.
And let me pull this up.
George, you want to be talking while John's looking?
Yeah, I don't see us sitting through another presentation with the city council, and I think that's what you're suggesting. I would encourage this council to have their own presentation from the Department of Parks and Wildlife, and then after that, then I think we could have perhaps a discussion at some later point in terms of some of the points and suggestions that we received from the Parks and Wildlife Commission. But I think to have that discussion prior to the city council understanding the bigger picture would be a little premature.
You know, George, I can see what you're saying, so maybe it would just be, but for me, I don't mind sitting through the presentation a second time to know that they've sat through the presentation.
Well,
You know, I know, because, I mean, it still is going to be a joint issue in terms of the management, and this is, to my mind, an open block in the schedule versus trying to, you know, hope that they make it a priority in their other scheduling throughout the year. So you never know. They might see the presentation, but it's June, and it's too late to really start working together. So I understand what you're saying about not really having the conversation until they've had a chance to absorb it, but I wouldn't mind doing it if that's what it takes. And depending on the other meady topics that
That's what I
we
was
had
just gonna go through,
developed,
yeah.
you know.
Maybe if I go through some of the other topics, I'll put it more into context since we're going there. So we had 1, 2, 3, 6 potential updates. One of them was the bears, so we have five more. Believe it or not, the bike race, that's getting back on our agenda again. Aspen was selected prior to a bid process this year is a different process, and so they're looking at putting that together. So Nancy will be looking to give an update on where they're at in that process. There's also some housing guidelines, and I'm not sure which ones are coming forward yet. I have not gotten a briefing, but it would be with the new APSHA director, Mike, and I've met him twice now, Kozdrowski, I think, and Cindy. They've got a number of housing, I think it's 2 actually, housing guideline changes that they wanted to propose to both bodies. They are asking for an update on our facility plan, which would basically hasn't gone much farther than what we did in budget, but they're just looking to understand what we've been looking at. I think we would have the same question right back, kind of talking about the master planning processes. Aspen would like to update us on the Cozy Point Ranch master plan and process. And then just to close the loop, and I think this would be brief, but to keep them updated on where we're at with our airport discussion. So there are a lot of topics on the table, at least from an update perspective, as well as decision-making being the housing guidelines. And then we have fares also.
Yeah, I just recall our last conversation we had here in terms of how productive our meetings are with City Council, and I think it's good to have some updates, but it doesn't really provide a venue opportunity for have some broader discussion. So we're going to get an update, and this is great, and here's the next update, and thank you and goodbye. And so we leave with the public. It's great for the public because they're going to get a lot of good information. But for me, and I think to go back to Michael's comments, I'm not sure we're having a sort of more of a in-depth strategic type of discussion. I would like to perhaps think about City Council has come up with their 10 top goals for the coming year. You know, how can the county play into that conversation to help the city achieve those goals, and vice versa, as we're looking at our strategic plan. You know, where do they coincide, and where are the opportunities to help one another achieve the goals for the community as a whole?
You'd like to make that's a great opportunity for a discussion, but you want to do that as part of this meeting that's coming up? That's like a whole meeting in itself, which would be a great meeting if we had a venue where we actually had the discussion, as you said, which right. I think is a great idea, because that's some of the input I had from the constituents at the election is, what's the relationship between the city and county, and what can you do about making that a better relationship?
Otherwise, we're just exchanging bills.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
You know, I don't see it quite the same way. You know, I think that you get a housing priorities update, and you can give input as to why you agree or disagree with those things. And you know, the facilities master plan, I think it's interesting because we get a certain amount of information from the newspapers, thank you very much, but it's also good to hear kind of straight from the horse's mouth. And you know, I think that for me, there's always this kind of difference between what a county commissioner is and does, and a full-time salary, and a city council on an honorarium part-time job. And we kind of keep expecting them to be county commissioners and not understand that their role is a little different, their time commitment's different, and their issues are different. And so I'm all for trying to make the meetings more productive. I'm less sure I need to hear about the bike race now, or the bike race couldn't be a memo, or things like that. I agree with that. But how our facilities and their facilities work together, and construction management plans and things like that, I think they're pretty important to us and the public. And, you know, just you brought up Cozy Point Ranch. We had received this very detailed packet about Cozy Point Ranch, and I was wondering, did it go to the wrong people? Have they sent it to the city? Did they think, you know,
the equestrian
did they? Yeah, the equestrian uses there. And I just thought, well, I hope they sent it to the city too, because we're not the decision makers on that.
Austin works for the city.
And so let's make sure that that's the case.
There's that whole book
so
up there.
I don't see it quite the same as just exchanging memos. You know, I think that each one of these should allow for some dialogue, questions, input, and things like that. So it's more about how we set up the discussion of each topic. The one thing I thought would be interesting to talk about when you talk about housing guidelines is housing needs, because the city's been soliciting public input on, should they do more rentals, should they do more ownership, should they do more single people housing, should they do more family housing. And we've done fairly extensive research on the categories of need for our own efforts, but we haven't, you know, our housing programs are really very far apart. And so I'd love to talk more about the housing guidelines, their housing needs, their housing agenda, and how they can mesh together, particularly for categories and the types of categories of need. So I'm a little more open to the format. I mean, I guess that's all I'm saying. And I'll put out there one last thing is I really would like us on the next quarterly, not this one, but to have a large portion of the agenda dedicated to water issues. I spoke briefly with Mike McDill, the city's rep to the 1177, after the meeting in Glenwood yesterday, and said, you know, how informed are you keeping your council, and how up to date are they on, you know, some of these things that are coming down the path that will affect our valley. And even right now, that planning group is prioritizing the top, quote, 3 projects for the Roaring Fork Valley. And, you know, it feels awkward for all of us to be going, well, I think this is a top priority, but who am I checking in with? Who do I really know that from? And so that would take a lot more time to structure it. So I just want to put that out there. But Mike said he thought it'd be great. The more involved the city and the county are commonly on these water issues, as you know, that. But I think that would take more planning to put together. But absolutely, we should have a joint water meeting. I sometimes read about issues the city has done that they're dedicating water to in-stream uses by watering their parks less in the paper and not through other avenues. And yet we're kind of jointly working towards same water goals. So I'll leave it there.
Well, getting back to the meeting that's coming up, I'm not saying that we should have the 10 top issues for the city discussion at that meeting. I'm saying I think that's like you saying with water, that's maybe a discussion we want to have in the future. And as far as what I'm saying, George, is that he was saying that, you know, maybe there's some things that we have out of those 5 items for the meeting that could be just, we could discuss it, but what really decision-making are we going to be doing there? The housing thing will probably be something that just has to come back to us if they're looking at changing issues in the housing guidelines. That'll just be an informative, this is what we're looking at, because it has to come back to each body, right, for approval. So I just think, you know, trying to fine-tune the time. I don't expect them to be county commissioners. I know they have limited time at these meetings, but they also want to know what's going on our side. So I think this is a perfect opportunity to use the time wisely. As far as the bears, if we're going to have the presentation, that'll take up the whole meeting, for half of it, because then we have things to do right after that meeting on the 3rd.
Can I have one last thing? You know, maybe another solution to this is that part of this meeting is dedicated to the concept of how do we make these meetings more productive for both the city and the county, and what do they expect to see out of these meetings, and maybe even kind of draft some future topics for the next 4 quarterlies coming up. I mean, it's always a little bit of a last minute thing, and if we were looking at the quarterlies on a bigger scale, there's some time left on the agendas for emergent issues or emergent items, but otherwise we could look at the quarterlies as really being a major topic area each time and things like that. I mean, that's just one suggestion, but maybe that's what we really should do at the first quarterly meeting of the year, is talk about how we make the quarterly meetings more productive and more meaningful.
And so in listening to you, oh, sorry, Steve, can I?
No, go ahead. I've got one to add to the list, but I'll do that after.
Well, I think the housing policy issues are fairly ripe, and that's something that we did direct APSHA to bring back to the joint meetings for those policy discussions so we can move them forward. So I'm wondering if maybe what we should think about doing is definitely have the housing issues on there. Provide memos on the updates. I think that could be our facilities master plan, the bike race, the cozy point, and then we can see what kind of discussions happen. But maybe we just need a future agendas discussion. Maybe part of the problem is this is so mediated between the staffs instead of the boards, the elected officials talking together and setting an agenda for us, that perhaps then we can throw the concept of the top 10 goals, or we can see where the council has some energy and we can set out our agendas in the future for that. Because I have a feeling between the housing studies and probably the questions that come as a result of the updates, and then brainstorming about what are those joint issues for, you know, future agendas or future discussions, we probably eat up a lot of that time. Because I could see actually that future agendas discussion taking some time.
Oh, yeah, should.
Yeah. Does that sound maybe like a reasonable thing to go back with?
I think that makes sense to me. I mean, and I'd love to talk with the city about their priorities, but we should probably do it after our retreat, and we can both share what came out of our retreat, what came out of their retreat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because the one issue you've brought up before, George, which it hasn't made our topic things, and I don't know that it will for a long time, but is entrance to Aspen. And maybe that would be a future agendas and things like that.
Water is another one.
Water would be a larger, and so, you know, we could divide the time so that hour and 15 is towards the larger topic that we've all chosen, and then the 45 minutes for emergent and update issues.
That's a good format, at least to bring forward anyway.
And then if we have time, should we offer to buy sandwiches and break bread together a few minutes beforehand?
We talked about different locations.
So we weren't
last
sitting
time.
at the long
Well,
desk.
we've traditionally, of course, done it there. We could offer to host it here, and we could have a robust discussion about our facilities master plan.
I think we should offer it.
Type
The idea
discussion.
was more of a round table
Yeah.
versus this long linear table,
Let's
which
try
is so formal, it's like, you want to put your shoe on the table.
If we could just take all those tables in the city council and scrunch them around
They
like
don't
this.
I don't know, so.
Pretty heavy.
I know you had
Anyway,
another
we could
issue.
Oh, I have-
offer here
yeah.
and with
But
the
I just want to get back to bears real quick, because the bears are going to be waking up, guys, really
This
soon.
weather.
I would like to suggest to the city, encourage the city to bring the Division of Parks and Wildlife, is that what they're called now, to one of their meetings and have and then maybe let's see what we can work on before the bears wake up. 'Cause that's something we can't wait till a future agenda, and I think we should just present it to them rather than show them the whole discussion, just encourage them, because how beneficial it was to us.
Agreed.
Yeah, and this is the meeting where I will not be at this one, and I'm sorry I can't be there. I was trying to think if I could have a satellite uplink from the canyon somehow.
You're in the canyon, you just stay in the canyon.
I'll be on river time, so.
Why are you jumping up that quick?
But
Sal?
the 2-ton gorilla that should be on everybody's agenda is the climate change issue. And very few government officials are looking at it really seriously. And but Aspen has really, taken the lead with the Canary Initiative, and we've done a lot also. But I think that would be maybe not at this meeting, but maybe at set it up for one of the other quarterly meetings.
That's on their list of 10.
Yeah, that's on their list of priorities, and they did
Yeah.
just announce some updates and changes to the Canary Plan, and I know I received an invitation to attend if I wanted to, but I was out of town, and so, they've been doing a lot, but you're right about how do we feature that or focus it.
And maybe
It could
we
be a
can
quarterly topic.
do more together and get more synergy going or something. Do you have something else, Patty?
No, I
Okay.
think the idea of how do we make the meetings work better and better use of our time is really critical.
Yeah.
Okay.
So other things we can,
Well, we can, either we have some open discussion items, or we can go into
Future
future
agenda.
agendas.
I want to go through future agendas and then.
Actually, do not have any future agenda items for you.
the only thing I would note, Steve, is that I know because of transportation issues, you may or may not be at the Tuesday, February 10th meeting, and that's when we're going to have the discussion of the East Side Airport Assessment Study Input Committee. So you should try to get potential names to John before you leave for the Grand Canyon trip.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Rachel. I've been trying to figure out my logistics. It did not work to take a plane flight back. I tried every possible way, so
Yeah.
I'm just going to be on the road, and I'm very likely going to be doing the part of the drive that morning to get
Yeah.
back here, because
Yeah.
I don't
but-
think I can get out of the canyon and drive all the way back and get a good night's sleep here. I'll have to sleep somewhere along the way, most likely, but.
Whatever
And I might
works,
not
you
be
know, we
here
can't
at the
all be
beginning
here.
of the meeting. I'm more likely to be here later on in the meeting, so.
Just
Patty.
it's still, I'm really planning on being here on the 25th.
Oh, it doesn't have to
Yeah, I noticed that, Patty, that your name
You
was
know,
still.
unless it's pouring rain in California, and they'll probably love it if it is, but.
Yeah. George?
John, I didn't see on future agendas where there's a work session for us to discuss our retreat.
Yes, we do need to get that on there.
Oh, yeah.
probably for you and for staff, probably the sooner the better, right?
Yes.
So anyway, you could plug that in wherever.
Okay.
Steve, this
Patty?
is just for the board's information. Well, coming up on the February 11th, we have some second readings on the marijuana issue and on the PM10, and I'm going to see what I can do to get some background history on that, because it's second reading on both those issues, because those are new issues coming.
I think first reading is tomorrow on the
First reading is
marijuana.
tomorrow,
Oh,
so you'll
and
have
the
a
PM10
chance to.
too?
Yeah, and the PM10 is a fairly minor issue, IGA. The marijuana is really updating around caucus requests.
Right,
yeah.
because okay. Then we
So,
don't need to worry
yeah,
about
so you'll
that.
have an opportunity to,
Well, the PM10 is of great interest to me, because I go way back in history with that. Okay, great.
Yeah, that's on tomorrow's agenda too, so we'll all be learning about that. Okay. Any board members have any other requests for the agenda for future ones?
Not at this time.
Let's see, 212.
might want to take a little break before
Yeah,
the
let's
next
take a break.
discussion, which
Let's
was
take a
pretty robust.
10-minute break right now.
Actually, we were originally scheduled for a 15-minute break, and I need at least the full 15. I'd
Okay.
rather do a 20-minute break and then kind of be back on schedule, or, I mean, we were scheduled for a break between 2:30 and 2:45, so if we get
Okay, welcome back to the Board of County Commissioners work session on January 27th. The next thing on the agenda is special events regulations, which have been being talked about a lot lately by the Planning and Zoning Board, and this is our first big look at them. And so we have Cindy Hubin and Mike Kramer here to present for the county. And Alan Richmond, who's been working on them, is here also. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Mike Kramer with Pickens County Planning Staff, and we are here for an agenda item summary for special events. And Steve, I was just thinking, we don't want to talk long, but we do have a short presentation for the board, and I thought that I would give some background on the history of this and where we are today. Alan's going to give some background on the rewrite and the research that he did. And then Cindy would talk about some public outreach that happened with our department and the caucuses and the neighborhoods. And then we would give the board the P&Z recommendation, a couple of suggested alternatives, and if that's okay, all right with you.
Sure.
Okay. So Pickens County is currently in a moratorium in the rural and remote zone district, and the moratorium is a result of a large private wedding that happened on the backside of Aspen Mountain. And basically the ramifications of it were that a loophole in the land use code was used where we don't regulate large private events. We have special events code language in our land use code that regulates special events in the form of trail runs and public parties and temporary commercial uses. We don't regulate special private events in the county. So we're currently in a moratorium, and that expires on March 18th of this year. So it's coming up relatively quickly. And I just want to give the board a background of what our land use code says today and how we regulate special events. Special events and temporary commercial uses are regulated by the Community Development Department, and it's an administrative review. We also have the ability to kick up any bigger applications that the board may want to see, like Pro Cycling Challenge or the X Games. Those are the typical ones we've used and brought to the board. But basically, this is our code language right here, and it says special events and temporary commercial uses. All applications shall make adequate provisions for public parking, site setup, maintenance and cleanup, public safety, and availability of emergency services. And that is our code language, and that's how we regulate some of the smallest events down to the haystack hoedown, all the way up to ESPN X Games. And this language is really great in a sense that gives staff a lot of latitude to regulate small events and medium-sized events and large events. We have the ability to tailor conditions and standards to each permit so that the community addresses the needs that we need to have when an event occurs. But what this doesn't do is it doesn't have site-specific or specific standards for different parts of the county. It leaves some uncertainty for event organizers, and there are some cons that basically that occur with having loose language like this. But that's what we use today, and that's how we're currently regulating special events. As I said, currently Pickens County Land Use Code doesn't regulate large private events, and that's what we're doing here. So on September 23rd of last year, the board and ComDev staff had a work session, and we talked about how the Land Use Code should get rewritten. And at that time, we had engaged Alan Richmond, who's here with us today, and he did some research and suggested some code amendment language that we could use to adequately address special events and temporary commercial uses. In that work session, the board directed staff to parcel out urban areas, rural areas, and rural and remote areas for regulations, and do basically a comprehensive rewrite of the land use code. The board also directed us to investigate special event venues where a property is actually used as a commercial venue for having multiple special events, and we've also explored that. So that's the background on where we are today, and we'd like to have Alan just give a brief presentation of his research and the rewrite that he proposed to us.
All right. So some of this will be very familiar to three of you who are here, and Patty, this is new for you. But this is kind of a condensed version, a very condensed version of the presentation that I gave back in September. So basically my research began when the staff and I came up with a list of counties that we thought we ought to examine. And you see on this slide 14 different communities that we reviewed in detail. Their regulations, 7 of them being Colorado. You'll recognize counties near and particularly other resort counties. So we've got Telluride there. We've got La Plata, which is Durango. We've got Eagle for Vail, Summit County. Those would be fairly obvious. And then a number out of state as well. So a couple of wine country counties, Sonoma, Napa, Santa Barbara, all having fairly significant regulations in place. Teton County would be Jackson, Summit County, Utah would be Park City. So a lot of sister resort kinds of communities that we looked at the actual regulations and kind of tried to identify specific features in each of those regulations. The other thing we did is we talked to the Planning Advisory Service. That's a research wing of our American Planning Association, and they have a lot of codes on hand. And they were able to lead us to some codes that we might not otherwise look at. Mike, can you jump to the next page, and then we'll go back to page 1. So the report that we presented to you had this table in it, and I'm going to summarize it so you don't have to try and read every word in there, but basically we tried to organize our findings into 4 or 5 categories. So one issue was, does the regulation use a minimum threshold for when a permit is required? Second thing, who's administering these regulations? Is it a staff function, P&Z, board? Are there exemptions that are utilized in other communities, and are there any special or unique provisions? So if you can go back to the first one. So in terms of thresholds, we found that using a minimum threshold is very, very common. So many communities look at how many people are going to attend your event and have some number below which you would be exempt and above which a permit would be required. The thresholds we found, the lowest was actually 50 persons. So communities are regulating very, very small events out there. The highest threshold we found was over in Eagle County, 500 persons. So there's a pretty wide range of what people consider to be an event of a significant enough size that it requires a permit. I'd say the 200 to 300 persons is kind of the median, kind of the one that we saw come most often across these communities. And we did use that threshold, you'll see in the regulations that are proposed. 200 to 300 is certainly used in the urban area. We're a little bit lower in the rural as to where the permit requirement might kick in. The second thing we found in terms of how they're handled, just like we do here, as Mike said, special events permits are typically handled by staff. Typically they are under the temporary use regulation portion of the code. And most communities do exactly what we do here. If there's a larger event, or if there's an event for which the staff gets a bunch of objections from neighbors, they will bump it up to the Board of County Commissioners. So in terms of procedures, I think you're right in the mainstream in terms of the way that you handle them. Exemptions. Exemptions has been a very interesting topic for us to address. And most ordinances that we have reviewed do provide for some kind of exemptions. And they vary widely as to the types of things that are exempt. I think it would be very common to exempt events that take place at a place of assembly. So, for example, we expect events to happen at a church, or at a school, or at a community center. We expect events to happen in a park, or in other communities, a stadium, an arena. In this community, we might expect certain events to happen at the base of our ski mountains. So those kinds of events typically would not require an individual temporary use permit. You would have anticipated the event when you permitted, there's going to be a church here, there's going to be a school here, or that's going to be a base area in the ski area master plan. You might have anticipated events. So we've taken that point to heart, and that is in fact included in the regulations. So the way we've defined special events, events that happen at a place of assembly do not require a special event permit. Now, other communities you see exempt certain types of events, like weddings, funerals, and other private events at a private residence. And as Mike said, based on the work session that we had back in the fall, That was not the approach that we were directed to take, and so that is not in the regulation today. And that's probably been the most controversial thing we've been dealing with for the last month since the regulations have been made public. The other thing we looked at in terms of the research was whether any of the communities had special or unique provisions in their regulations that might be very applicable here. And there are a couple of things that I think are very useful that we did mention to you back in the fall and that we have incorporated in the regulations. We found that Gunnison and La Plata counties both are addressing venue properties. Just as Mike said, venue properties is a really big topic here, particularly in Woody Creek, maybe less so in areas like Frying Pan has talked to us a little bit about venues, and Snowmass Capital clearly is dealing with venue issues. And Gunnison basically says if a site gets used frequently for weddings, that's no longer subject to a temporary use permit. You're now getting what they call a commercial use permit, what we would call here a special use permit. La Plata does a similar kind of thing. They limit sites to just 3 temporary permits per year, and after that, you're in their next level of impact. They have an impact oriented. They don't use zoning there. They don't use a system like ours. So you'll find that we have incorporated some of those ideas into the issue of venue properties here, which we talked to you about in the fall. And then the other thing we mentioned is La Plata has a provision that limits site setup to no more than 48 hours prior to the event. And that seemed, everybody that we've discussed that with seems to think that that's a particularly useful thing in the rural and remote zone district, maybe less so in the rural and certainly not relevant in the urban areas. But you know, the Little Annie Basin, a lot of the complaints that were raised were the fact that that event took like 3 weeks to set up. And people might say, you know, I can live with an event for a couple of days. I understand that something big's happening in my neighborhood, but 3 weeks gets a bit absurd. And I think if you have a standard like a 48-hour limit on setup, what you're really saying is we don't want you to bring urban levels of infrastructure. Don't import that into a rural area that doesn't have any infrastructure, and kind of limit the duration of your impacts on neighbors. The last thing I'll mention is in the research we found a wide array of performance standards that were being applied by other communities. Mike showed you the four little points that are in our code. This is kind of what most communities are addressing in terms of performance standards. And the list goes obviously quite a bit beyond what we have in our code today, which is really quite bare bones, as Mike noted. So the last thing I wanted to mention to you, I kind of wanted to follow up on Mike's comments about the direction that you gave us back in September 23rd, and maybe sort of anticipate what some of the issues are that we need to deal with today. So as Mike noted, there were really 4 things I think that you gave us direction to address in these regulations. The first thing that we were told is don't limit the regulations to the rural and remote zone. You opted for what we called a hybrid approach in our presentation, that there would be a base set of regulations that would apply countywide, and then there might be some additional limitations that apply in the rural and remote zone district. And you'll see in the code we followed that kind of approach. And second, we were directed to write regulations so the exemptions wouldn't be granted based on the type of event, but there would be this threshold approach that we've mentioned where we consider the number of attendees and other measures, not just the number of persons, but other measures to determine whether or not a permit must be applied for. And I think the 3 of us have found unquestionably that those 2 aspects of the regulation have been the most controversial thing that we've been dealing with over the last month in our conversations with P&Z and contacts we've had with caucus members and the public in general. And I think if I were to try and summarize in a sentence what we've been hearing from folks, it's that by taking this type of comprehensive approach, we've created a regulation that at least some feel has become very intrusive or would be very intrusive into people's private lives. And when we were meeting with the P&Z last week, I thought one of the commissioners really kind of hit it on the head. He called special events, he used the word outliers. And he said, you know, when we think about special events regulations, we all know we're trying to regulate the outliers. So the big events that happen not so frequently around here. We've obviously just been through one last week, and nobody would question that. But, even big parties in neighborhoods can be outliers. What people have expressed to us as a concern is, while this regulation that we've put forward clearly can handle the outliers, it's meant to address the outliers, people are concerned that the way we've drafted this, we're catching too much in the net that we've put out there. And specifically, people are concerned about private parties on their private land being regulated by this. And I think really this is the thing that we all need to be talking about in terms of moving this regulation forward. If it turns out that the board members share the concern that Mike will express to you in terms of P&Z's comments, my thought is we don't need to take what we've done so far and throw it out and start over. Frankly, there are multiple ways that we can work with this draft and address the concern that we've been hearing from folks that this is maybe a bit more intrusive than people had expected. I think P&Z has given you great suggestions in terms of modifying the attendance and other thresholds as the way to handle this question. What we would be very reluctant to see happen here would be to step back and say, the problem is we're trying to regulate private events on private property, and we shouldn't be doing that. Because frankly, that was the loophole that Mike referred to at the beginning of his presentation. That's how we got here in the first place. And I think the board was on the right track when it said, let's not regulate by type of event, let's use the thresholds. And we certainly spoke to the P&Z about that a lot over the last few meetings, and as a group, they seem to have adopted that direction. The last 2 points that we got direction on, the use of performance standards and not writing the standards in the form of don't do this and don't do that and a lot of denial type stuff, but using the standards as a checklist, that's in there, that's working. Nobody seems to have concerns with that. The venue properties being special review use, that seems to have gotten very good reception at the P&Z level. So, it seems to me that a lot of the direction we received is being received now by the public well. The issue that we need to figure out is how we handle this threshold question. With that, I'll turn it back to Mike and Cindy.
Rachel.
Oh, well, if you guys are going on with more presentation, I'll hold my
Yeah,
comments.
leave a little bit more.
Yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to let you know that while Mike and Alan were putting these together for you, we also went out to the caucus groups and asked them with a review, a referral, how they felt about these draft regulations. And so we've gotten back this wide spectrum of comments. And it's everywhere from the frying pan, which is, please, we don't want any regulations at all on special events. We don't have any issues. We're not concerned about that at this point. To the Woody Creek area saying, we have some very specific concerns that we quite frankly think that the rest of the community may start to feel as well. But right now, Woody Creek is feeling a lot of commercial impact in the sense that there are properties that are zoned residential but are acting like venue properties, like commercial properties. And I think you got a couple letters in the last 2 days from that are included in your packet from the Woody Creek Master Planning Committee and caucus group, as well as an individual. So those are new additions to your packet that Mike handed out today. We also heard from Emma and Crystal Caucus in the middle saying, please give us more time. Well, they had individuals asking a lot of questions and definitely a lot of opinions on what way to go. In general, both the Emma Caucus and the Crystal Caucus said, boy, we need more time to look at it for the rural area, for our area, and talk about those, not only just the thresholds, but this regulation in general. So we did have a wide spectrum. We got individual comments, some people talking about threshold is what we really need to look at in terms of number of people. Some people approached it from an acreage perspective, saying, well, if I have 100 acres, you know, I could probably have a situation where nobody's going to ever, you know, worry about the off-site impacts versus someone with a, you know, half-acre property having a large party on their property. But we tend to disagree with the acreage approach because of a number of things that could be off-site impacts relative to that property. But we definitely want to talk a little bit with you about the thresholds, and we are, I'm going to let Mike get into this, but we think that the P&Z did a really good job of review, and that some of the major issues with, you know, what we want to approach in the rural and remote zone district are pretty clear given the P&Z recommendation, and also the need for that venue type regulation where if someone really was coming in for a property that is somewhat commercial in nature and holding multiple events, that would require going through a special review, much like we did for Elk Mountain Lodge, much like we did for the Red Barn property in the Crystal. And those seem to have worked well because the neighborhoods had a chance to talk about what was important to them and the conditions of approval. So with that, I'll give it back to Mike briefly, and then you guys.
Okay. This is in your packet. What I have up on the screen here is the P&Z recommendation. It's a lot of verbiage. You know, I don't expect you to read it right now. But the basic tenets of what the P&Z recommended is that the rural and remote zone district portion of these code amendments were generally acceptable. They also felt that the special event venue portion that Cindy was just talking about, which would be a special review to the BOCC, is also generally acceptable too. What they had reservations with were the urban and the rural tables that basically we had proposed. And I don't think the structure or the way it was written was what was objectionable. What was objectionable was the numbers and the standards for the thresholds. And what you have in your packet for today's agenda is the actual strikeouts and underlines of the land use code that we proposed. And that is basically the P&Z packet that they got on January 6th and January 20th. They did 2 readings. And that was their recommendation. It's there. And we heard that recommendation, and we gave them the full breadth of information that you have right now. And what came out of that meeting was that we felt that the board should have a work session and talk about this. So what we're doing here today is that we have a work session in between a code amendment process. A code amendment is 2-step. It requires P&Z review and then Board of County Commissioner review, and there's 2 hearings. You have tomorrow scheduled a board hearing for first reading, which is a public meeting, for these proposed amendments. And we thought it'd be really good to get the board together to talk about what direction you'd like to go, and get an idea the day before so that you can see how you want to move forward with this meeting potentially tomorrow. So with that, here are some alternatives that we came up with, and these aren't at all, back this up a little bit.
Process alternatives.
Yeah, these are some process alternatives. And we are certainly not trying to box the board in and use these exact alternatives, but these are some ideas that we had. So given all the information and the research we've done, the code rewrite and the public input, what could happen is that the board could move forward tomorrow and have first reading and consider all these code amendments as we propose them. First reading is scheduled for tomorrow. It's a public reading. And then second reading is scheduled February 11th, and that's the public hearing. So if the board wanted to, they could do that. If they wanted to, the board, so that's alternative number 1. Alternative number 2, the board could move forward with the meeting tomorrow and use the P&Z recommendation and only move forward with the rural and remote zone district portion of this and the special event portion of this. And that way we at least start the process, the board process now, for amending the land use code to get those on the books. So that's alternative 2. Alternative 3 is that we could take this whole meeting tomorrow and push it forward into February if we wanted to, and give more time for the staff and the public to deliberate this, talk about it, to refine this. And we could just move first reading forward to February 11th, and we could get board direction then. So what we did was we prepared the board for the meeting tomorrow. You have the whole packet. And what we recommended was alternative 2. And we thought that the BOCC should move forward with the meeting tomorrow, but only the rural and remote zone district portion and the special events venue portion. And that's what we think.
Can I just get a definition? Can you, it's not in the section of definitions, at least I didn't see it, is urban. Are we talking urban growth boundary?
Yes.
Okay. And did we ask Aspen and Basalt, since we're talking about their urban growth boundaries, if they had any input?
Well, I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Since we're talking urban growth boundaries for the urban sections, did we consult with anybody from the city of Aspen or Basalt?
We did, yeah, both
They're-
jurisdictions.
They're okay?
Yeah, yeah, we did.
Just want to
They're
make
both
sure that
okay.
we've, I'll have more, but I know Rachel had some.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering your exact question, but I'll give you my thoughts on this. This strikes me as being almost similar to the whole oil and gas discussion, where they're trying to balance the private property rights of the surface owner versus the private property rights of the subsurface owner. And this is the private property rights of a surface owner and their property versus the neighbor's private property rights. And, you know, one of those, as I recall very succinctly from real estate class, was the quiet enjoyment of your property. And I just want to make sure we're not weighing so heavily to the one side of private property rights to do what you want with your property versus the private property rights of the neighbors and people who feel the impacts. And so I can understand their hesitation on wanting to wade into this area, but I think that issue particularly comes forward when you talk about special event venue areas. And it also strikes me that we might need to do some investigation outside of our traditional realm of planning and zoning, because the Chaparral Barn, using an example, at what point does that stop becoming an agricultural property for ag tax purposes? And I think that should be investigated, because you know, we've struggled with whether people are paying their true value of property tax for a long time on the gentleman ranches. We've seen some changes in the law that allows assessors to use the 3 acres underneath a revenue, the actual residence, as being a residential value. But the rest is commercial, I mean, is ag. And it seems that if there's vastly more income being generated to use the barn than the hay that's stored there, the horse you rental, you know, at what point would us issuing a permit for a venue of any sort that's continual, that has risen to this kind of semi-commercial permit for commercial activities, start to affect someone's tax status? And I'm not saying it's a bad thing that it does. It might very well make a few people think twice about how many events they want to hold on their property and what is really more valuable to them. So I'd like to see some investigation on that. I like the ideas that have been discussed so far that you're looking at, the threshold approach. I like performance standards. And I just think that this multiple event venues, however, special event venue items, this is such a tough area for me. You know, it makes me think anytime, and you know, we heard these things from years and years ago, maybe forecast by Mick Ireland and others, that these larger homes of 8,000 and 15,000 square feet would never be supported in the long term by just residential purposes and uses, and people would start practically making them into boarding houses or commercial retreats or special event venues. And we're seeing that happen. And I think that I'm not willing to let the private property rights line go so far to say, well, I own a residential private property, but I can make it into a commercial activity outside of the urban growth boundaries on a regular basis, that's my private property right. It just is not the same. I mean, we have very limited restrictions as to what is a home occupation, what you can do in a home occupation already. And I think we need to draw off of those sections of what is allowed in home occupation and how is this similar or not similar. But what's the difference of someone saying, I'm having a party every Friday night? You know, I'm having a special event, dance-a-thon, every Friday night because that's my private property right. You know, I think we're writing the code not just for today's circumstances, but for what boards will be dealing with 10 years from now. And I can just see some real explosion of private house parties, helping pay the rent, and all sorts of different things going down. So I don't want to inhibit someone's private property rights to hold a wedding for their best friend's daughter. You know, it doesn't have to be a family member. But if you suddenly have come up with 10 best friends across the summer, that's starting to really impact the neighbors in an unacceptable way, in my mind. You know, I think it's something that if the frying pan doesn't feel they have an issue or a need now, that's fine. It's maybe similar to other codes where they, over time, came back to saying, well, we would like to limit house sizes, we would like to do this. And so, you know, I think that that's fine, you know, and we've written other codes, such as the marijuana codes, with specific instructions to different caucus areas based on their referral comments. If the Emma caucus is asking for more time to continue contemplating these areas and things like that, well, to me, that really begs the idea of moving forward the components that we do support and have support, such as the rural and remote area, be able to lift that edge of the moratorium. You know, maybe we'll hear it tomorrow, but I would like to hear your larger recommendation for the moratorium itself. If we get certain codes in place, would it be okay to lift it? Should it be modified and extended to only encompass the areas we don't have? Should it just be lifted altogether? You know, things like that. So I want to hear your recommendations on that going forward. And so I guess in terms of your recommendations for our board, I think we should at least begin the discussion tomorrow. I don't think it does us any good to kick it to the February meeting. And then at that time, and with the discussion of the board, we'll decide which portions of it to move forward and which we can allow more time for more work.
Let's have George and then
Okay.
Patty.
I'd like the way that you've actually presented this and broken this down into 3 different categories: urban, rural, and remote. And of course, as you stated, this whole discussion was precipitated by a very large event in a rural remote area. And at the time, we decided that we needed to look at that. And so based on a lot of the discussions and feedback that I've gotten, I would agree with staff that the most controversial or difficult part of establishing some sort of regs is in the rural area, dealing with, as Rachel says, private property rights and how to address adjacent properties and all the impacts. And I'm assuming that that as the caucuses are updating their master plans, that they'll start to take some of these concepts into consideration as well. And so that process is ongoing, and that hopefully will be completed within the next year. But I can see us moving forward on setting up some new regulations and ordinances for the rural and remote areas, as well as for event venues. That does a couple of things. One is that seems to have the most support. We've seen very little opposition to those ideas. And it addresses the need why we set the moratorium to March, because of the concern for event planners that needed to start to think about summer events. And so we would be able to pass on the information that they need in terms of what they may be able to do and what they would not be allowed to do as they're working towards their summer. And so rural and remote would accomplish that, and looking at the venues would accomplish that. I think we will need more time, caucuses will need more time to look at some of these recommendations that have been presented, and have further discussions in terms of what they feel would be best for their neighborhoods.
George, are you asking that once, if we move forward tomorrow, that then the information gets sent back to all the caucuses, or just to the 2 where?
Well, what I'm
I wouldn't have a
suggesting,
problem letting everybody know where we are.
what I'm suggesting is that tomorrow we can move forward on first reading
On
as
those two
suggested
issues.
on option number 2, and then at the same time be able to, this was a lot of information I heard from some caucuses members saying, you know, we got this 28 pages to try to decipher complicated graphs, a lot of, it was just too hard to digest. But you've sort of condensed this down, we can condense this into sort of executive summary for the caucuses. Here are some ideas for rural areas specifically, and that way they have something to really bite their teeth into. And so I would
Yeah, I
send it
just
out to
need
all the
clar-
caucuses to
Yeah,
answer
I
your
just need a
question.
clarification on that, but I had some other comments too.
Yeah, go ahead, Patty.
I agree with the direction I hear the board moving in. I think that the checklist, just so you guys know, having recently planned a major event myself in a different county, I kind of used a checklist on my own behalf to check off the things we would need and the impacts we would have to surrounding neighbors. So it makes great sense. The 48-hour prior setup is a great idea because of timing for the event planners and all the different people that need to come out. It's much easier, as you see from the X Games, takes how long to set it up, and overnight most of it's gone. It's pretty amazing. So I think that's a great idea. You need to have those limits so the neighbors aren't impacted for days on end of an event going up or coming down. I think that makes great sense. The checklist, again, I think is a great idea. It allows people to know what may or may not be. And as far as a rural remote, you've given great thought to the sizes, and I agree with, because if you have a small event of, say, 25 people, you know, you may not need to have amplified music outside in a permanent building or, you know, or in a permanent building. So those what you're allowing and not allowing makes great sense. The special venue, you know, the buildings that are being used for other purposes than what they were originally built for or intended, I think that does need to be looked at carefully, because those impacts can be ongoing year-round, week after week after week after week, and we know what that means to a neighborhood. I think that needs to be really, and I think we've done a good job looking. I'd like to see if there's any other comments that might come in on that, though. But and when you have multiple events, like say I do have 5 really close family members, or not even members, but friends of the family, how would you keep track of permitting? Because you wouldn't have a permit process, so I could technically have had 12 weddings, oh, thank God I didn't, you know, on my daughter's property, without having to go through a permit process, and so we would never know. So I don't know how we'd get a handle on that. That's just a question that, you know, how would we, you know, by then the neighbors would say, you know, there's been 15 weddings there this summer, and then we'd go, whoops. But I mean, I don't have any ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, some
I
ideas.
like
I don't know
that.
how effective they would be.
Throw them out.
Yeah, so one is that we would do, if regulations got adopted, we would do outreach with the planners, the party planners, and let them know that this is now law, and that we have to start having permits for these things. Luckily, there are a number of party planners that we work with, and that includes like the film crew that we need a film permit, or
Right.
a special event permit too. So we would do outreach, but you're right. How do you go and regulate the party as it's occurring or after the fact? And in that sense, the only thing I can think of in my mind is that we would take, you know, complaints from neighbors to tell us that it's happening, and talk to the property owner and talk to the one organizing that party.
Well, I'm thinking more of myself just allowing my home to be used for friends and family to have their weddings there, and at the end of the summer there were 5 or 6, which is kind of exceeding our limits. It's not like, you know, you have 1 wedding a year or maybe 2. So how would we as staff or the BOCC have a track record of that house had been used or is going to be used with, because those little events wouldn't have to have a permit, right?
The smaller ones would not.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, the smaller ones would not, and we would have to rely on the public and our observations.
Rachel?
Difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, Patty. An awful lot of our codes are violation-based enforcement, and they always have been, they always will be. We don't have the staff, and we'll want to have the
Right,
staff to go check things, but that tends to work okay. You get your neighbors mad, and you haven't talked to them in advance, and, you know, they're kind of willing to let you know there's been issues. So I think that is worth maybe having a paragraph section in it so that people will know how will this be tracked, or, you know, what will be the number that people call to raise concerns or ask questions about whether an event nearby was permitted or not. We need to make this very accessible for the public to be able to use. The thing that strikes me, and I could have missed it in the complicated pages, as George has said, but what are the penalties for violation? You know, what will happen if someone says, well, the penalty is only $500 and I'm getting paid $5,000 each time I rent my place, so to heck with it. You know, what is there a step ladder of more serious fines if you have repeated violations from the same property or parties or things like that? I think that is an important component of what happens. What can we do when, you know, that happens? The other is that I think that when this goes out to the various caucuses, as it should, for further questions and answers, we should give them a few examples of why we're proceeding to even look at these codes. You know, it might not seem like it's an issue in their area now, but if they have a little better understanding of what's occurred in Woody Creek and what could occur in their neighborhoods, I think it'll brighten the picture. And I think that it's really clear that we need to have some examples of why we're even looking at this. And I don't know if I said it before, but I do really believe in that concept, and maybe it could be fleshed out a little more carefully or fully about when does repeated use of a special event venue rise to needing to get a commercial permit and starting to have the hearings and appropriate. But I appreciate that counties that are, you know, I would say far less regulated than us, like Gunnison and La Plata, have come to the conclusion that, you know, if it's happening multiple times on the same property year after year, it's a commercial property and needs a commercial permit.
To add to that, Rachel, if they're abusing it and they're using their home and making money off of it, comes to the point where the assessor's office comes in and they reclassify that property as commercial, and that's a much bigger hit than a fine.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another trigger point. I don't know how that would work into it.
I don't know how it works either.
It's just a thought to see how we can manage these. You know, there's so many great little homes out there, great backyards for weddings, and we don't want to stop that personal touch. We want to stop it when it becomes a commercial impact to those residential neighborhoods.
Yeah, and you know, I'll go further. That's why some should get a commercial permit, but that's where
go through that
that's where the
process.
neighbors have a chance. Long-term conditions can be put on it. Opportunity for review in future years. Because I'm as aware of anyone else that a lot of times agriculture can really struggle to make it in our valley or other things, and this could be an important source of farm revenue. I don't want to limit those things, but at the same time, you have to go back to our original code. What the biggest flaw that was in that language is it said nothing about neighborhood impacts. That's the one thing it doesn't say that will be part of the special event permitting review, is neighborhood impacts, and that's what we need to address now.
And I haven't weighed in yet. When I have read the whole thing, and everything I read was really well written, and I think very well thought out, and it's really up to us as a board to figure out if, you know, do we want to go ahead with portions of it. Portions of it, I think, we all pretty much agree that we could go ahead sooner than later. And kind of the filter I was using was thinking of the events we've had on our property over the years. Over 54 years, we've probably had 10 weddings, and they were always family or close friends getting married. We never rented the place out for, you know, accepted money. And we had some pretty big weddings there, granted, but it was all contained on our place, and we never asked permission and never, you know, needed to have a permit for it. We had ski races, and we've probably had 10 ski races over that whole period of time. And I think the last one, Suzanne Wolf said, well, we were thinking about requiring you to get a special use permit for the last one that we did a few years ago, but we weren't required to do that. So that's the filter, I think, on looking at your thresholds, the size of the tent we put up, which the only big tent we ever put up was for my parents' memorial services there, and what should be allowed and what a person should be required to actually get a permit. And most or all of the things we've had, I feel they should have not been in the column permit is not required. And yet, if you look at the thresholds of that, perhaps they wouldn't have fit. They would have gone into the minor event permit is required based on the numbers that you've put out here. So I think for a private party where it's truly, you know, you're not making any money on it, it's not a commercial venture, I think that, you know, we probably should raise the thresholds as the P&Z has recommended. If it becomes a commercial kind of a venture, then, you know, that's crossing a line, and we need to take a harder look at that. And I don't think we want to have a different threshold, but maybe one of the thresholds would be added to this, that is this a commercial venture and not just a family event?
Or frequency.
Yeah, and if it's a commercial thing above a certain level, like if we had one commercial wedding on our place in a year, that might be okay. Well, if we start doing one a month or one every week, that's crossing a threshold, so that needs to be considered too. In terms of the timing for tomorrow, I'm sure that portions of this will be continued to a future meeting, because we definitely need to get more input from some of the caucuses, more thought into the threshold question, and, you know, what do we actually want to regulate more closely. I think even the special venues question, probably more research or thought needs to be put into that. It's obvious we need to do something because it's being abused mostly in the Woody Creek area, but probably to some extent in some of the other rural areas also. And tomorrow, I'm not sure if we would pass portions of it tomorrow. We might possibly be able to, but even in the case of the rural and remote, are the thresholds too low, or should they be raised? And should the Castle Creek caucus or Maroon Creek caucus or the different, caucuses be allowed to weigh in on that? Give people a little more opportunity, even for the rural and remote thresholds, which I remember in the discussions we had last summer, there was one group that held a big party up on Little Annie every year. It's an annual thing, and they have way more people than you have in your threshold, which I think, what did you have, 50 people was the threshold, or 25 people. Mm-hmm. And they maybe had over 100 people for an annual local event at I can't remember the point.
Picnic Point.
Picnic Point, yeah.
Steve, just to also point out, it doesn't mean that you're prohibited from having an event above 25, but once you exceed
need to get the permit.
That would be the minor review permit.
Yeah.
Steve, can I just ask the process, if we were tomorrow to have really high thresholds and move it forward, we can reduce those. In other words, we can go to less stringent without having to go to another reading, correct?
Yes.
We can't just become more stringent. We can bring the numbers down, we just can't bring the numbers up.
Actually, I think that's the opposite, because bringing the numbers down would be more stringent.
Yeah, if you brought.
Oh, well, right.
Yeah. We can bring the numbers up.
Bring the numbers up. That's what I meant. Making the code less stringent is what I meant. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, so we could bring it bigger tomorrow and then reduce it if need be.
I just want to reiterate Cindy's last point, is we're not saying you can't have parties.
Right.
Even
Saying
in a
this is
rural
how you
remote.
can.
We're just saying based on the number of people, you may have to go through a different process. And that process will address safety concerns, it will address access, it will address a whole list of things that I think are important.
Things
So
that
the
should
town
be
put a
addressed.
couple
So
of-
we're not saying you can't.
Yeah.
So that's true for the rural, and the way it's drafted, the rural and the urban areas, definitely. And Alan, I think, was just about to point
You
out
do it.
that in the rural and remote area, though, we felt that because of the unique aspect of the intent of that zone district, there are hard and fast limits. Now, 25 is the, smaller limit based on what the Forest Service requires. Once you get past 25 people in the forest, you need a permit. So we just use that as our starting ground. Whereas, once you get above 25, up to 100, then you need this, minor review permit. And then we do have hard and fast, no fireworks in rural and remote. Structures are limited in size to,
And 100 is the limit.
and 100 is the
We
limit.
put 100 as the top set, figuring.
In rural remote.
Yeah, that's a big party for middle of nowhere. If the number's too low,
That's
that's
what the
our working
discussion's about.
proposal.
Yeah, I mean, we could discuss that. Of course, who's gonna count? And, so you have a party over the course of the day, so people come, people go, and so maybe there's 125, 130.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's,
No, we
how
understand.
do you account for that? But I could see us raising on the rural remote just slightly to allow for that, but
Yeah.
I still think we can move forward
But a
on it.
wedding of 300 people felt like it was beyond the capacity. of
With
that
20,
area.
with 27,000 square feet of tent.
That was really beyond the capacity.
Double the amount of servers. But I think the other point about having a limitation is not necessarily that we're going to be out there monitoring every event, because we don't have, as Rachel said, the staff to be able to do that. What it does is it gives us the ability to enforce on those outliers. The ones that have gotten out of hand, it gives us the ability to really enforce on that. And I think Rachel brings up a great point as well, like, what does that enforcement really mean to someone? And right now, we would just be pointing to the violation section of the land use code, which has its own procedure for enforcements. And, but if you would like to see a specific enforcement tied to this, which is specific to special events, and it has a monetary enforcement structure to it, we'll need to bring that back to you if it's different from the rest of the land use code.
Yeah. I'd just like to see what's in the rest of the land use
Okay.
code,
Yeah.
to see the sufficiency of that, and then we can decide whether we need more or not.
Well,
Okay.
Steve,
It seems we may, but I don't know.
well, George brings up a good point as far as who's going to be counting heads as they come up the dirt road. The thing is when you have events like the Picnic Point Picnic, it's just a community invite. So you never know if you're going to have 10 or 110 or 1,010. So that's a tough one, and those are seldom, and the impacts are, they don't put up 27,000 square feet of tent. But that's something else, and I don't know how you would manage that. And then there's also, for the bigger events, I don't know about, looking at, do you have a formal guest list, RSVP list? I mean, that could give you some idea. If they're saying we're having 100 people, but they sent out 500 invitations, I mean, I don't know how, you just have to believe people are telling you the truth when they come in the door. It's a tough one. It's a tough one because you want people to be able to celebrate events in an appropriate manner and not disturb their neighbors.
One other question I had on the permit is not required. I presume that most people, if they're gonna have a party, they're not gonna be thinking permit, they're gonna just go ahead and hold their party. But you don't expect people to come and check with you to see if they're near the threshold, or if they don't think they need a permit, they don't need to come to the front counter in community development and say, we're gonna have a party and we're gonna put up a tent that's, we don't know exactly how big it is, but it, might be over this number or it might be under. What do you anticipate the process working like?
The tent is really the interesting one, and Mike has pointed this out at the P&Z. The building code today, without us touching any of this, the building code says if you put up a tent of 400 square feet or more, you need to come in and see the building official. So we've used 400. It's not that we've introduced some new threshold. That's in your building code.
That's already in there. Okay. Okay.
And that relates to safety, and some tents have walls, some don't, you know, that sort of thing. But I also wanted to point out that at the P&Z level, they also had, I thought, a good discussion about the intuitive nature of thinking, wow, this is getting kind of big. I wonder if I need a permit. You know, so the thresholds maybe need to relate to when someone might say, I wonder if I need a permit for 300 people, you know, versus I wonder if I need a permit for 25 people in my backyard. It's definitely, we want to try to make this, the thresholds work on that sort of intuitive level as well, although our code is based on standards. And so if in fact a standard is broken, then the code can be enforced. And once again, it's hopefully a situation where we're really being reasonable and looking at those outliers.
Well,
Would you have any, I'm not going to say, not the word spies, but say if a caterer,
party crashers?
if a caterer comes,
That's beyond
you
our
have
job.
lines of communication with like catering companies.
So I was going to say
If
the.
they come to you and say, we're going to be doing a party for 500 people in, you know, in such and such a neighborhood, and we don't think they came to you to get a permit, but.
I'm not gonna-
Well, that does happen. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, the folks who are in the business for party planning or catering or tent installation, those are the guys who really we do want to talk to the most, because they will help their clients know when permits are needed. And we have all kinds of things where people turn other people in.
Well, see,
So I
that's-
guess it's probably more just communicating with these organizers of special events for people, that they would know what the thresholds are, and you're in close communication with them, so
We
then you'd kind of rely on them to tell their client that you really need to get a
That's what I was
permit
gonna
for this.
suggest.
And it's interesting to us too, we've had several people come up who are event planners from outside of the community, but they're used to needing permits, so they show up. So it's kind of interesting on that level too.
Patty?
No, that's what I was going to bring up, but I was bringing it up in a different context than the words you used. But, you know, being the people who you rent the tents and the chairs and the tables from, they should be advising the person. For example, for me, just not going through a party planner, being my own, they should have said, you know, you're getting up to meeting the threshold, and we would rather not see your event shut down. So, I mean, that's a great avenue for us to have that enforcement piece.
You know, the other thing that is a component of this, I think, that we haven't talked about yet, and it relates to the user-friendliness of the system or whatever, but that's going to be the fees. You know, people will be more likely to say, oh, let's keep it down here, or say we're down here because of the fees. And so, you know, I want to see what the fees we think will charge for the difference between no permit, obviously nothing, to small event permit, and make sure that that doesn't become a barrier to people applying appropriately for their permits. I think we should put some time into those who are willing to disregard the rules, and how do we deal with the rules and the neighborhood impacts. But I'm not going to go crazy over it. I think it's kind of getting into the weeds, and I think that that's kind of something that you can come back to later and say, you know, it's almost like a warrant study for traffic speeds. You know, they'll say, well, we'd like to lower it from 30, and then you study it for a while and say, well, most people are actually going 35, and your warrant study says you should really raise it to 35, not reduce it safely. And so, you know, if we end up with our thresholds at 50, and sometimes these things end up being more like 60, 65, and we say, well, that's still okay, we can raise that limit and make that, you know, more comparable to reality. I guess the other example is how you watch where people walk, and then that's where you build the trails versus putting in your sidewalks and watch them leave all the trails and go wherever they want. So, you know, I want to make this user-friendly, and I think that there's ways that we really can get it out to the caucuses, to the party planners, to people like that, and it becomes a little bit of an obligation of your own to know about this. I think we have great channels with Pat Bingham to get information out, shows on Grassroots or inserts in the paper as we're getting, maybe that's, when the Aspen Times does its annual wedding planner edition, we need to have an ad in there that says, please be sure to contact Pickens County, Special Events Department and make sure your event is not outsized for the location it's planned on. So I'm not as worried about using a clicker and counting people, and I think that those things become apparent. And this really isn't to eliminate the, I think it's to augment the party planners' trade, really, that they're going to be in safe locations. In some of these places, it's real important that the electric hookup is done right. No one is electrocuted on the party. These aren't casual events. It's important that the scaffolding doesn't fall down and people are injured on the dance floor. These are real things. It's important that there's sanitation and no one gets food poisoning and so on. That it's not that the county wants to stick its nose in anybody's private business. It's just that these are legitimate obligations and responsibilities of the county. And again, I commend you guys all and the P&Z for really, working through a thorny issue. And I think we can get to something that's reasonable and in some ways mirrors our current practices and what people are allowed to do in the communities, but just adds that safety factor and takes care of neighborhood impacts.
Rachel, if I might jump in, Steve, we did have numerous comments about fees. Mm-hmm. And so that's a good point that you brought that up, that people feel that, the fees would be a burden on them. And I always said that, it's something we would discuss with you. Obviously, it's staff time, and there's a lot of coordination that goes on with an event, with public safety, or with other departments that might need the fire department. So it does take staff time to make an event coordinated through a permit process, but ultimately we do need to hear your feedback on whether or not you feel that certain things should be either exempted from fees or kept to a minimum. So that would be a further discussion.
Okay. Any other board questions or comments?
I think it was well done, and I think we should have a party.
We should have a big party when this is all done.
Yeah, 25 means you're going to have one single person no matter what. It should be 26.
See, we based the number on, we used to have something called the planning office picnic.
Oh, yeah.
In the day when I was on the staff, and it was up at the top of Aspen Mountain, and there were about 50 of us.
We could do it as a test run.
That seemed to, no amplified music and no structures.
Right.
A lot of gourmet food and wine.
There
A lot
are,
of people walked home.
we do have quite a few members of the public in the audience, and I wonder if any of the people came here to hear this discussion about the special use permitting process, and do any of you have any comments you'd like to make at this time? Okay, no comments.
Well, we'll be here tomorrow.
Thank you, Cindy and Mike and Alan.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you tomorrow.
This was very good.
Yeah.
Thanks for your letter, Jane. Thank you. Yeah, I became the expert on party planning, let me tell you.
Let's see, the main other item we have is the broadband expansion, and then several open discussion items. And is Kara gonna actually be here, or are you presenting that?
She was going to come down, so maybe we can cover some of the, we have some open discussion items to cover. Maybe I've sent them an email, hopefully they've gotten that, and they'll be down here. But do you mind moving on to?
Let's go ahead and
open
work on
discussion
open
items?
discussion items.
The first item is a letter that was forwarded to you. It had come through George and Core on a request for us to sign on to a letter to Governor Hickenlooper regarding development, making basically electric vehicle infrastructure and promotion priority for Governor Hickenlooper's second term. And so I just handed out a copy of that letter. Now, George, and it may be in here, it wasn't clear to me who's sending this, who we had our names. We can figure that out. I guess the more important question, does the board wish to add Pickens County's name as a signature to the letter?
Steve, can I, having read this, because I did get it on I got an email to me. I think it's a great idea. I think we really need to emphasize the need for the infrastructure. Because one of the problems with electric vehicles is you can only go so far. And so if we're going to encourage that and, do an executive order, et cetera, I think and it's kind of built in there, right, George, is the whole need for the infrastructure to support electric vehicles is a key part of supporting electric vehicles, obviously.
I think so. I'm just trying to figure out where this originally came from.
Because I don't have, I think it stands for Pickens County and what we just talked about as far as electric vehicles and, our whole support with CORE and our bringing fleet vehicles that are electric into our own fleet. And I think that's important that then we would support it on a statewide level. And thanks for bringing it forward, George.
I'm okay signing on. I think it's one of multiple requests for things that we'd all like to see more of in the next year. And I don't think it's detrimental to any of the positions. We're currently purchasing a couple electric vehicles ourselves to try to move that forward. And I do think, this is one of those letters you sign on for, so you don't really have wordsmithing opportunities in that classic sense, which is something that Michael has kind of objected to. He has said he doesn't like to see us just signing on to other people's letters. But I do think that there's strength in numbers, and if we want to send a separate letter if this issue really is picking up some traction or something, that'd be great. Frankly, I think there's a lot of other issues the governor's going to be dealing with, such as balancing the budget and higher ed funding and all these other things that are a challenge right now, than taking on new initiatives. But you never know. He's got 3 or 4 years to think about it. So I'm comfortable signing on to this and move on to the next item.
The one point that, depending on who is the official person sending the letter, if it were a Pickens County letter, I would personalize it a little more and just mention that we are purchasing 3 electric vehicles and putting in charging stations for county use, and that several charging stations have been put in for the use of the public, and so sort of personalize it to Pickens County. If it's a bigger letter that's coming from multitude of organizations, we wouldn't want to do that for sure.
Yeah,
and that is the case right now. There's 24, maybe 30 signatures. It looked like that they had for the letter.
I think we just sign on.
So for sure, the concept of it, I think it's something the state should move forward on, and the governor's leadership would be welcome, and we should urge him to provide that.
This was originally put forward by the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. So it's a nonprofit organization, and they are trying to figure out. They're in a 6-state region that includes Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. So I'm sure this is just one of their initiatives that are looking throughout the region.
If it weren't for the pillar blocking my view, I would have moved on to our second item. First, we have representatives from Scott Tipton's office here today. There's going to be a changing of the guard, I believe. Come on up. Yeah.
Hi, Commissioners. I'm Christian Reese. I've been with the Congressman's office for the last 2 years.
Nope.
And,
Go ahead and have a seat, please.
I have been very blessed with the opportunity to take over as the Executive Director of Club 20. And so I will be handing some of my counties that I've been responsible for over to George Rossman. George comes to us with a great deal of experience. She worked for Senator Campbell's office for just shy of 8 years. She's been a small business owner, and so I really think that she's going to be a great asset to Picken County. And so I just wanted to introduce you all to her today.
And I know quite a bit of you guys. Yeah.
I thought maybe you were party planners. And
That's what I was doing. When Senator Campbell retired, I started an event planning business. So what you guys were talking about was very interesting, actually. And I know exactly why you're talking about it. So I understood some of the issues.
I had the honor and pleasure of working with him on a bill that we were moving through with Picken County right before he left office, and he was my last visit in Washington. And I was really quick, jumped in and said, we really need a sponsor, and he got buzzed to go vote, and he goes, you got it, Patty, you got it, I'll sponsor your bill.
I love it.
So he helped us move that bill forward, and I appreciate it, because I used the ploy, my middle name is Campbell, so I got it.
How do you use that a little?
It's the family ties, yeah.
But no, so yeah, I've got some experience, and I know John well, and Rachel forever, and I've met her. So I'm looking forward to working with you guys. So, and I'll leave some of my business cards.
Perfect.
So we just
I don't have
wanted,
any yet. So.
we just really wanted to say hello, and so you have a face, and you know who to, if anything comes up.
Great, that's great, thank you.
And then you'll still see Christian around with Club 20.
Yeah,
but
congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Be going to Denver tomorrow, so
Okay, we'll
for
see
the
you there.
legislative trip.
thank you,
Yeah,
buddy.
Rachel and I are the
Thank you.
two
You brought me
who
back
go
in.
to
Thank you.
lots of
Good
Club
afternoon.
20.
It's nice
Yeah.
to
Rachel
meet you.
to more, but I'm also
I
going to,
know that I've seen you
Thank
there.
you.
Quite a
and
few of them.
certainly I'm familiar with Miss Rachel. So.
and speaking of Ben Nighthorse Campbell, whenever I wear a string tie, which is my dress tie of
Polo.
choice,
Mhm.
to any event, I always think of Ben
Ben
Nighthorse
Nighthorse
Campbell,
Campbell.
because he was the one who stood up in Congress
He
and
did.
and said, you know, this is what I want to wear. I don't want to wear the white man's kind of
And
straight
they
tie.
literally let him get away with it. So, yeah, it did change that one, so.
Well, thank you all for just letting us have a couple minutes here, and then I'm sure George will be in touch if you guys have any issues,
bet.
any grants that you're working on that you want a letter of support for from the congressman's office. We'd be more than happy to write something for you guys. So any way that we can help Picken County, I really think it's an opportunity to further that relationship there. So.
Well, I know you weren't planning a long visit, an extended visit, and I think there's probably just one thing I would mention with the board's indulgence, and that is we do have issues with the Thompson Divide area down in the Crystal, and I'm sure you're familiar with that.
I am.
It's quite likely that we could line up John and perhaps our attorney to brief you with our perspective on those issues. Particularly, just not to go into great detail, but we are very excited and happy that the BLM is doing what they're calling curative NEPA or whatever on the leases in the Thompson Divide area that legitimately were not done before. And to be totally clear, beyond any of the rumor mill or anything that's out there, we have never wanted or pushed for the review of any leases outside of Picken County's boundaries. The BLM themselves realized that, hey, we got this issue here, we have the issue on some other leases, we better clean everything up at once. And that's what they're doing. But we never asked for review of leases in Mesa County or Rio Blanco or Moffett or anywhere else, and that shouldn't be put on us.
Right.
And we're hoping just to see those processes expedited so that the leases that are within communities that are either producing or they'd like to see producing move forward, you know, with a clean bill of health, and they move forward expeditiously. And we'd love to see the review of the leases in our areas moving forward expeditiously as well. But there were legitimate fatal flaws within that process. And I bring this up mostly because I know Club 20 is crafting its priorities list for the legislative tour and the following year. And Club 20, of course, works closely with and offers great representation to the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. And that is a little area where we have a little teeny bit of friction, but I think there's greater common ground in all of us supporting that severance taxes do not be raised, that severance taxes do not be diverted, and that the processes the BLM has undertaken are expedited. You know, we're not going to, I think it's last year's argument to tell them, don't do these things, because they're doing them, and they're continuing forward with them. But there is a lot of common ground. I think we all believe that severance should go to the impacted communities under the current formula, no balancing the state budget with that, and again, no new severance taxes on the industry. It's going to be struggling enough, but that ours is a bit of unique circumstances here. There were fatal flaws in how the approaches were taken before, and that's the only reason the BLM is looking at it again, believe you me. If they could afford it, they would have. So that would be one to really spend a little time on, George.
And I will definitely pass that along.
Okay,
And
thank
I
you
know
very much.
that Club 20 is looking at trying to nail down a time to meet with the governor's office when we're in Denver
Okay,
regarding the severance tax diversion proposal.
yeah.
So I'm sure you saw that letter, but Club 20 sent a letter out.
I did in the Grand Junction Sentinel.
Yep, admonishing the poor fiscal policy of diverting severance tax dollars to balance the general fund. So that's something that we.
This was discussed really briefly at CCI over the last 2 days, and the one thing I threw out there is if this is running into problems with Tabor, why not ask a statewide Tabor debrucing question of severance taxes
Sure.
and take it off book?
There you go. Right.
And it would, like others, probably, pass fairly readily because it's an existing thing. But that might be a simpler fix to this and not use Tabor as the reason to go after severance tax, but debruce severance from those limits.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So, well,
Great.
thank you all very
yep,
much.
we
We'll be
appreciate
in
it.
touch with you
Nice to meet
Okay.
you. Good luck.
Nice
See
to meet
you Thursday.
Thursday.
Oh, you're going to be in Denver?
Oh, certainly.
You guys have a great day.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thanks, you too. Thanks for stopping in here.
Appreciate that.
Phyllis, does Karen know we're running early? I shot her an email.
No, it's me covering this one.
Oh, you're
Okay.
covering this one.
Jump
Okay,
on up
well-
the hot seat.
Do we want to keep on open discussion, or do we want to move to MOIs?
One more item that I would like to talk about is the CCI bylaw changes and how our relationship with CCI is, and whether we could do that after Phyllis, so.
Yeah.
Go to the MOIs.
To bring it up.
So this, for the public's benefit, is discussion about the broadband expansion supplemental budget request.
Okay, Phyllis Mattice, Assistant Manager. And I'm carrying this one that Kara wrote because Kara's going to a state OIT meeting on broadband in Denver. So she is on the road already. Beautiful day. Pickens County put out an RFP for really a design build for broadband. So we've been attempting to figure out how do we expand broadband in the county for so long, and various entities, experts kind of give us their opinion, and we finally said we need something in writing. We need a plan. So the RFP went out. We had $120,000 approximately budgeted for this. We had 3 finalists that we interviewed. All of their proposals were at about $150,000. One interesting part of the one proposal included a lot of public outreach, financial modeling, looking at where do you get funding for this, where can you get grants, how does it come together. They had a high caliber team that they put together. Advantage, I can't remember the second part, it's an engineering firm. The lead person on the project had done this in Virginia and spoke government and public-private partnerships really well. So that's who we wanted to choose, and we really see the benefits of having a financial model first and being able to do outreach and making sure where we want to target broadband is where we really need it. That's really the phase 1. They expect they can get that done by the spring. It's, I think, about a 4-month project. So we'd like to roll right into the design phase then, looking at the 2 finalists that we had that were more on the design side. We kind of got ballpark figures from them, asked them what it would take, because one firm would be doing a little more of the legwork work that they had proposed in their proposal also, at $100,000. So we're asking for, I'm not on a touch screen, a total of $250,000 with the 121 that's already budgeted. So an additional 128,000 to be appropriated, and this is out of the translator, TV, FM, and now broadband cellular fund. The expenses that we have here are considered available because of the ballot question we had in 2011 to research the potential for broadband and cellular. So what we're doing here fits within that, the definition that we already had our citizens approve. And Connie gave you a fund balance of $500,000 after we use these funds, but we have put off a lot of capital building until we get these projects figured out for the design, because we don't want to rebuild a site without knowing how can we best maximize it for cellular and broadband in addition to just TV and FM. So we are looking to redesign Upper Red, which is one that has some critical needs, but Williams Hill is working just fine. Would it be nice to have a better building? Yes, but we can hold off.
So the 984,000 in the 2015 budget for the mountain site facilities projects is
on hold.
On hold, except aside from maybe doing a little bit on the Red Mountain.
All right, we're going to try and get some engineering work done on Red Mountain. We found out recently there's enough space there to actually build something new without having to build something new first and then move our things over and then take ours down. So there's room that we don't have to figure out how to build in the same place, which is possible.
And I just add, it's in the memo, but for the public that's watching and the press that's in the room, we basically put a placeholder, $40,000 a year, while we tried to figure out, what can we do, what should we do. So it's not an issue of us having budgeted, $120,000 and gosh, now it's $250,000. It was a placeholder, and as we went through the RFP process and really figured out the scope of, at least from staff's perspective, what we think is best for the community and to move this issue forward. That's where we came out, is the 250 and why we're asking for this appropriation now.
Patty?
I just want to mention at the Northwest COG meeting on Thursday, the broadband guy, I can't remember his name, he was great, and he is so excited about what Pickens County is doing and working with Pickens County, and he couldn't say enough especially about working with staff. He said you guys were great. Of course I agreed.
It's really nice having Northwest COG's focus on it, because a lot of the counties in Northwest COG are attempting to move forward, and Nate knows what everyone's doing.
It's great.
So we all are learning from one another and advancing at different stages, and we have different needs, which we all knew. But we're all hoping that whatever we do, other counties can learn from our model.
Which is part of working regionally, and it was great. It was great to hear what was going on in all those other counties, but he was really just boasting about the great things happening over here. It was great. So, yeah, I'm really supportive of this. Does this come back then to us on a regular agenda? Is that how that works? I forget.
So, yeah, what we do is we do these, and then quarterly there will be a formal action that accumulates all of them.
Okay, I just can't remember. Thank you.
Rachel?
Yeah, I'm supportive of the budget request. I appreciate your work and Kara's work on moving this forward. The thing I want to make sure we're kind of weaving into this is the timelines of how quickly this would be completed versus, or in consideration of, the governor is trying to make $3 million available through DOLA for broadband grants this year. And then there was a larger presidential Obama initiative, and I can't remember, that was $20 million a year that's coming out. And so I'm not sure what those grant cycles are and how far along we need to be prepared to apply to those. And then the tangential item with those is the Senate Bill 152, which we're continuing to try to work on as well. And I did go to the special telecom communication meetings in Grand Junction, which was, I think, the 7th of January, and that seemed to move forward fairly well. It was the subcommittee changed their previous broadband principles, which in the past said things like, they're 10 years old, but they said that county, city government should be aggregators of demand and help facilitate the process. That was the only two roles for government. And it was, somewhat industry slanted with the, we want competition, and that should take care of all our problems. But as time has played out, areas where there is no market continue to not attract any competition or any service at all. And so that subcommittee did change the language to say something along the lines of the role of local governments and municipalities is to watch out for the economic well-being of their communities as it relates to broadband and things like that. Those positions will have to be adopted at the end of March at the Club 20 March meeting, and they may be reviewed again even further on the, is it the 20th or the 19th of Club 20. But they're a bit of an ally with us, that's why I'm bringing this up in changing 152. And this continues to proceed apace with CCI figuring out what they need to do or not do. So that's going to be a big push for us also. So this is going to be the year of broadband, and getting this sort of work done in the background is going to be great as a long-standing county goal.
Well, and we're hoping DOLA is going to allow some funds to be used for development, which some of our project might be eligible for.
That would be great.
But right now, I haven't heard, but we're
Thinking it's infrastructure only,
yeah.
not planning grants.
And at this point, we can't do that with Senate Bill 152 unless there's a change or unless we have a question, which is what a lot of communities are looking at.
Very good. So we all support
I would
this?
also support this.
Very good.
George?
Thank you.
Okay.
We have a great working relationship with Greg Winkler from DOLA, so we can always encourage that too when the time comes.
Back to open session?
Okay, yeah, back to open.
The bylaws, are we doing that?
So, Steve, I think you wanted to talk about the CCI bylaws, and then I also had the two legislative issues that you were asking about yesterday. So maybe if you want to just run with those, I'll...
Okay. There was a very important business meeting at CCI on Thursday afternoon after our legislative committees met, and it was very well attended. Nobody left, and a lot of people came on the phone also. And all of the proposed bylaws passed, which required a 2/3 vote to pass them. Some of the votes were very close. They just by one vote. So the things that passed was an increased notice requirement for business meeting agenda items, which previously was a 10-day notice and now is a 30-day notice that is required. And ostensibly that was because many times when the business meeting happens, it's right before, the meeting's right after Thanksgiving, or it's right after Memorial Day, where oftentimes counties wouldn't be meeting in it. The 10-day period falls during this public holiday, so they wanted to give more time for the notice needs to be sent out earlier than was previous. That passed without any trouble. The second one was to allow for minority reports. Minority reports would be if the people who were supporting a position on an issue, when they come out on the losing end of the vote, this allows, if 25% of the people were opposed to something, they are now allowed to have a minority report, which would be something that's already allowed at NACO meetings on their legislative positions. They commonly have minority reports given. On the Supreme Court, they give their don't know if they call it a minority report, they might have a different name there, but
Dissenting opinion?
Your minority opinion?
the minority opinion. So this is the same principle that just assures that those who come out on the losing end of the vote can still make sure that their points are heard and entered into the record. So this was split into it applied to two different portions of the bylaws of CCI. The first was general policy positions, which was in one article, and so the second one would have to do with actually the legislative issues would come into a different part. But, so we voted on both of them separately, and both of these passed. This was what most of the discussion was about, because the problem in CCI is the minority viewpoint oftentimes has been squashed by the majority, and people have sometimes not even been allowed to speak because someone would call the question and then people would be waiting in line to speak and wouldn't get to speak on the issue and things like that. So this gives, the fact that this passed just gives people one more voice and a chance to summarize their viewpoints and put it into writing and have that entered into the official record. The minority report cannot be used by CCI staff in their lobbying efforts for the majority position on those. It's more for the record for the other CCI members to put into writing their minority viewpoint. Then the third area we talked about was the supermajority requirement, which already there was like a 2/3 majority was required for passing a bylaw change. That was already in there, but this will make it so that for any, on the legislative issues or anything, it's required to have a 65% majority vote now to pass anything in CCI, whether it be a support or an opposed position on a legislative issue, or to pass a bylaw change or anything. This was contested very, very much so. The general thought, I think, is that when CCI does take a position now of support or oppose, it will be a much stronger position of support because more of the counties would have supported it. Whereas before you might have a 51-49% kind of a vote on something, and the CCI staff goes to our state legislators and say this is CCI's position on something, when they barely would have a majority of the vote supporting it, and you have almost half the counties opposed to an issue. So this will make sure that when CCI actually says they support or oppose something, they really have the backing of 2/3 of the members who voted on it.
So can I ask? It's
Yeah.
about you and Rachel. Were you there, Rachel? You both supported these three changes? I figured. I just wanted to make sure we were clear that that's the direction we were going, and I agree.
Yeah.
We had talked about them at the orientation briefly, kind of on the fringes. We knew something was cooking. So, okay.
And really, this vote was very important for the future of CCI.
To keep people
If
at the
some
table.
or more than one of these had failed, there probably were several counties who were going to walk away from CCI.
That's the
and quit
rumblings I
supporting.
heard on the fringes.
They might even now still walk away, but
An effort was made to keep them there.
yeah, the things did pass. And Rachel, I forward to your comments also.
Thank you, yeah, and thank you for detailing those measures. I'd like to give a lot of credit to Lynn Paget from Ouray County, who really took up this challenge coming from the Colorado Springs December meeting of CCI up until Friday of last week. And she and I worked together to craft potential amendments that the organization would accept and would be for the better of the organization. And so I attended a meeting down there in December 17th, right at Christmas week, over the executive committee meeting. I also drove to Denver to attend the bylaws committee meeting and then, of course, the final vote. And so it really feels good that the extra time and work kind of paid off, because I think there was a point at which the organization was on the fringe of disintegrating in some ways and in a really significant way. And at the end of that meeting, to hear Art Goodkimes come up and say he was going to go back to San Miguel County and advocate that they stay in CCI for at least one more year, and he was the one who was absolutely going to be out the door no matter what, that it's worth the chance. And I think that, you know, you could divide it into progressives and independents and red states and blue counties and things like that. But when people stop and focus on what can we all look at that we all agree on, there's a lot to be done, as opposed to trying to bring the full force of the organization against individual counties or counties' interests. So these are really guardrails, you know, to try to pull ourselves back from our worst instincts to, you know, get that organization to support this rule or that rule, and bring the brunt of that organization against your fellow counties. So it's really about how we use the organization, and I think most people really recognize that we needed to slow the pendulum down from swinging too far from one end or the other. So it's very gratifying to see the vote pass that way after all that work, and it's going forward from there. And on a separate note, since I did just get an email that a bill had been introduced that we may want to lobby for outside of, or lobby against outside of CCI, we've just taken our positions for the next month. So we will not take new positions on bills for a while, and they will be heard potentially before then. This comes from Summit County, Senate Bill 15114. So John, I need you to start looking that one up. But it's concerning restrictions on the ability of county government to exercise its eminent domain powers for the acquisition of open space. And so it's a limit on county governments. And I think that we should both forward this to Open Space and Trails so that they would be aware of it, as well as ourselves. I think there will be some lobbying efforts to kill that, and
before it gets anywhere.
Before it goes anywhere. So Pickens County may want to work with and contribute to efforts to lobby to kill that bill that might be outside of CCI. When we talk about it at CCI, you know, I'm going to urge, and we hope that we will maintain a neutral position, and that this would be the type of thing that.
So we should get some information, send it on to Carrie and.
Carrie
Donovan?
Oh, yes, absolutely, to let her know that we would oppose that position. I'm sure Eagle would as well with their open space programs. I'd like to point out that, you know, condemnation has been something that I don't think has ever been used in our open space program acquisitions, but there, you know, it's just a limit to local government.
It's an opportunity if needed.
As needed. So that's one for us to be involved in, that's coming up legislatively, but it is not one that CCI has a formal position on, and I think that we should act in concert with others with similar beliefs to be able to kill that early. Thank you.
And I'm looking at the big, or Pickens County's position, we have not, I believe we have not sent our dues money to CCI, which is.
We talked about that last week. We have.
Yeah,
we haven't yet, but we will.
Okay.
Yeah, and my feeling, especially now that those three bylaws changes were made.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, I want to stay in CCI and support it and work under the new system and see how it works. And I think that's generally the feeling of most of the member counties there, that, you know, things should be better now than what showed up at the meeting in Colorado Springs in December.
Okay.
So I don't know the process for authorizing
John
sending
John's
the
got it.
money.
Yep.
It's already in the
We're,
budget.
it's already, it was an
Checks in the
administrative
mail.
action to hold it on. We can just
Administratively
move
take it
forward.
out.
Yeah.
Okay, then there are the two bills that Ginny Pingenot sent out emails. Rachel, did she send you those emails also?
Yes, I did see those to contact legislators and,
I've got
I,
them.
I haven't had a chance to contact on behalf of Picken County on.
I went ahead and sent, as an individual,
Yeah.
I just think I'm-
emails to both Millie Hamner and to Terry Donovan regarding the two bills in question.
Can you pass that? That's a different one.
So, Steve, are you bringing them up here so
There's the
that
second
we
one, Steve.
send more of a formal county letter in support of these to our
Well,
reps?
Steve and I had a discussion yesterday, and in that discussion, as individual commissioners on behalf of CCI, you can take the individual position. If they would like the county to take a position on any of these, it'd be appropriate to have that discussion here. And so I think that was the purpose of the discussion, right, Steve?
Yeah, and the one, like, for instance, the SB 40, county authority to levy retail marijuana sales tax, the committee, local government committee that Carrie sits on was hearing this afternoon. So already they have heard it, and that's why I went ahead and sent a letter with some more details about it and why I was supporting this CCI position.
I think it's
so-
great you were able to respond so rapidly, and I think it deserves a further discussion at a future meeting, because we're not, unless we want to get the bill list and develop a Picken County position in this meeting first, I don't know that we'll have the time to respond exactly. I mean, when we're at CCI, we vote Picken County's position.
No.
And then if we're just being asked to continue to follow up on that, it was the position we articulated as Picken County at the table. So that gets a little challenging to say, are we going to, because things just turn so quickly at the
No.
state, it suddenly sends up for a hearing on Monday, but we don't meet to Tuesday. Does that mean we shouldn't call in to say Picken County thinks this, or we should call in and say, I think this, and I think Picken County thinks this, but we won't know until after Tuesday when you've already had your vote. So we may want to think about what type of process. I would appreciate any more greater feedback, but you've seen those bill lists before, and if you wanted to start dividing them up and down already and have meetings among this group to say what we should say, then, all for it. But we just haven't set that up in past years.
I don't think that's what we're saying here is, both of you have been appointed to CCI, and as CCI is taking positions and you represent those positions as representatives of Picken County on your own, that's good. If we're going to take a broader position on behalf of the body, on a specific piece of legislation, I guess it was my thought that should come back to the whole body.
Well, and I'm
so-
not saying it shouldn't, but I'm saying we have to be ahead of that, not behind that curve. If we want to institute that policy, we need to start developing Picken County as a board positions in advance, so letters can be written when they're needed and as a rapid response.
I wonder if we don't know what the issue's going to be, and it turns around as quickly as this one does.
Well, that's what I'm
sorry,
kind of saying.
George.
Yeah, George.
I would just support John's comments. I mean, you and Steve are our representatives for CCI. You attend the meetings, you stay up with it, and we give you our vote and our support. And I know that as you know, these bills are constantly in flux and changing. And so to say something now, next week you'll change it again. So I would just go with supporting your vote here. I don't think we need to see every bill here and try to react on every issue. I don't think we can.
Yeah, and I agree with that, George. I'm just trying to mentally work my way through this, because I don't want to be in a position of saying, well, Steve and I support it, but Picken County doesn't have a position. I mean, and that's kind of the default of what we're saying, is that you're our representatives, go do it, and we have the position, and we're speaking for the board at CCI, but we cannot legitimately say Picken County supports this unless we have a letter from the board or as a discussion as a board as a whole. That's what I'm saying, because
Okay, yeah, that wasn't where we were trying to go with
that's where,
that,
I know
yeah.
that's not where you're trying to go. I'm trying to think, what is the phraseology that's correct? Steve and I support it, but Picken County hasn't taken a position. I don't like that. And what I'm thinking of is maybe we get to some place that's a little bit more like Club 20, where they have some broad principles and policies on all these different things, which we already have, I would say, based on our past actions. And then, when things come up and it's an off week and we don't even have a meeting that week, one of us forwards a concern to John. John could write a letter on behalf of Picken County based on our policy positions, based on our existing positions of things. I just don't know. It's a larger discussion to have, but I think it's important because there's always minutia. There's always little changes. There's always little things that happen, and how do we most effectively speak as Picken County with our strongest voice is what I'm looking for.
Right, and I guess I'm confused because I'm assuming that you are speaking for Picken County as our representatives. They're just like when we sit on any number of other boards.
Well, I think when we're voting at CCI, that's correct. And what I'm hearing is that, but if we're sending a letter in or calling to say, please pass this bill or please oppose this bill, unless we have a formal letter from the board as a whole, we can only say, I think this for Picken County, but our board hasn't taken a position yet. I mean,
Patty.
Yeah, in the past, years ago, we used to, if it came to a letter point, the letter would come back to the board if it was a formal letter.
Right.
I know these issues do change over, George, you're absolutely right. And we don't have any policies, it's a little late in the game this year to coming up with policies between that because it's all flipping over so quickly. I trust the two of you to know when an issue is going to be one that you say, whoa, this is one we need to bring back to the board, and oh, this one I think we can move forward on safely. That's why we've appointed the two of you to be on that with CCI, because you have the history with it and you know how the board thinks and works. So, if we want to have a policy discussion so we can prep up for the years coming, but I think we're kind of too late into the legislative game right now.
Yeah, when you look at the County Veteran Service Officers bill, which the state was proposing to add an extra $500,000 to the fund that would pay the salaries of the officers, I know that we could all totally support that, but now there's amendments being proposed that would require a match from counties to match. So if we're supporting our officer, an increase in his salary, and the state's going to pay some of it, and Picken County would be willing or not willing to pay some of it, that's a discussion that, maybe we would support Picken County putting some money into that. And so my letter to Millie on that, and the reason it goes to Millie is because she's on the Joint Budget Committee this year, and they're the ones hearing this question. I more just explained the issue to her and said, we work with veterans on veterans issues, and we share a county veteran service officer with Garfield County, and I couldn't remember if we share it with Eagle also. I know we share it with Garfield. And we have lots of volunteers helping out on veterans issues, which was one of the issues brought up, that other counties also do that. So I more explained our situation, and then I just said I personally support the CCI position on this. Picken County might take, if we voted on it and discussed it, we would maybe agree that we could put money into this also. We hadn't had that discussion, but so I didn't say that this was Picken County's position at all in my letter, because it's one, to me, it could be open to discussion. But I just wanted to bring the issue up that, we occasionally get these emails from CCI saying, please contact your senator or representative about certain issues, and it helps Rachel and me to know, how to approach doing our answers on these.
Do we have a stand on the second one, the marijuana issue?
Say
Did you
again?
take a stand on the second issue?
We've supported both of these, I think at the CCI level.
Yeah, we did, but then
Well, CCI
at
opposed it.
CCI,
Well, we support
it
theirs.
really was this whole issue of the fact that the cities are coming up with amendments on the one. We didn't discuss that at CCI. That's really a new development that came up just in this email. We supported the state providing the $500,000 because it's been an underfunded mandate from the state. Rachel?
Steve brings up an important issue, and I think we can only take this conversation so far today, and John, you can think about it further, but it's what is our legislative processes within the greater organization where we have staff expertise to feed information to us. Now, I know Nan sits in on most of the Health and Human Service calls, but that's a good example to make sure the link gets to us, because currently it's a great idea. The state is planning on adding, I can't remember, 125 or 200 more child care safety officers and child welfare assistants, but they'd like the counties to make a 20% match to that amount. Now, I'm not sure we'll even need one new with our demand here, or what would that fiscal impact be, or my assumption would be it's the right thing to do. We would make the budget allocation necessary to make that happen if we did need more. But I don't know if there's a greater hesitation or something like that on behalf of Nan or others. But that's just an example of how there's bills that affect every department. We just heard about one from Open Space. And how quickly do we get feedback from them? How quickly do they get feedback? What are their opportunities for informing our representation at the state? And we should continue to think about how we can keep improving those measures. So I'll leave it at that.
It seems like where we have the opportunity to act as a board is once these bills actually really become more or less finalized and they're going to go up for the vote, then we have the opportunity as a board to discuss it and then send letters to our representatives. But as I said earlier, to jump in early when we know there's going to be amendments and changes.
But see, that's when, if you wait till it's been fully amended, and then you say, well, we oppose it, they're going to say, well, why weren't you weighing in when we were looking at those amendments? I mean, it's kind of like, do you be there at the beginning of the sausage making or try to take it off the fire at the end? It can be pretty hard once they've gained a certain amount of momentum. But, I agree with what you're saying. It's a challenge to figure out when we can write formal board letters.
The challenge is you guys can only act as a body to a certain degree, and there's been a delegation, I think, to you and Steve to represent Pickens County at CCI, and then to represent CCI's positions, as we agree with them with our legislation. And I don't think there's a problem there. When we take that next step, though, of in addition to the CCI positions, looking for a county position, that's when I think it probably needs to come back to the whole body, just to be sure that, and so I agree. I don't think every decision should come back. We get nothing done. And we could never move that fast. But there is going to be a point where it makes sense for Pickens County to act as Pickens County, whether it's in concert or not with CCI or what have you. And those are the types of things that probably need to come back to the whole body somehow. But I think, what George is getting at, what you're getting at, that's going to be, at a milestone decision point, whether it's in the committee process or in the, once it's going up for a final vote. So I think as long as we can think that way, and the discussion I had with Steve was, well, if we want Pickens County to act as a body, behalf of Pickens County, these things need to come back to the board. If it's really you guys representing CCI and CCI's position and your participation on behalf of Pickens County and CCI, you should be running with that all day long. Absolutely. Okay.
I think a great example is last year when Senate Bill 23 finally passed and there was danger of the governor vetoing it. We were writing letters directly to the governor as a board.
Right, yeah, that's a great sample, so.
Great. Any other?
Okay, anybody else have any other open discussion items?
Not me.
If not, this meeting, work session's adjourned.
Tomorrow noontime, right?
Tomorrow
Yep.
noon.